Rayffered isn't very large. You could drive through it and miss it if you weren't careful. There are 3 stoplights, a little movie theater that plays movies from about 20 years ago, a drive-in diner, a couple of shops on Main Street, a lot of thick old-growth forest that surrounds the whole thing. It's peaceful, but most people end up leaving after high school. There aren't a lot of job prospects, and those who stay run the risk of losing children to the woods. Not really the woods, I guess. More like losing kids to what lives in the woods. They call them foresters, and they live in the deepest part of the woods. They're supposed to be spirits of loggers who have been killed in the old growth, which is a great way to get kids into the logging industry, let me tell you. They only come out after dark, and most people are smart enough to avoid them. The town has rules that every kid is taught from a young age, and most of us follow them for our own safety. It's not like they can be easily forgotten either. They're posted around town by the city council, and there are only a few of them, so it's pretty easy to keep them in mind. 1, don't go out after dark. 2, if it's foggy, don't go out at all. 3, if the fog suddenly appears, stand absolutely still until it passes. 4, this is absolutely important. If you see a forester, don't run. Stand perfectly still until they leave. Sounds crazy, right? Why wouldn't you run from some monster who lives in the fog? In reality, the posters don't really do them justice. They don't have any pictures of foresters, because most people who encounter them don't survive. The survival rate is something like 10%, so I guess that makes me an anomaly. I'm one of about 4 people in town who have met a forester and lived to tell the tale. My brother, however, wasn't so lucky. It happened about 10 years ago, when I was 10 and he was 12. We'd been at one of his friend's house, Tyler, playing Halo 2 and just kind of hanging out. The age difference between my brother and I wasn't too substantial, and our friend groups often intertwined. Tyler was a friend of mine as well, and I still talk to him every now and again. He blames himself for what happened to my brother, but I told him it was a fluke. Could have just as easily happened while we were on our way there than when we were heading home. It was summer, and that meant longer days. We knew the sun wouldn't officially set until about 8:30, and we figured we had all the time in the world. We were having a lot of fun blowing each other up and running people over with the warthog. We were all laughing like loons as the people online used some pretty colorful language to tell us how they felt about it. That's what I try to remember about that day, when I try to remember it at all. I try to remember my brother laughing hysterically at some kid calling him bad words, or how he thumped me on the shoulder and told me I'd made a good shot. I try not to think about what happened later. When Tyler's mom came to ask if we were staying the night, we told her we couldn't because our mom had made us promise that we'd be back before sunset. Then you boys better hurry. It's 7:55. My brother and I looked at each other, and I could tell he was feeling as panicky as I was. Not because we were afraid of foresters, though. Both of us thought the foresters were just an urban legend, something they used to drum up what little tourism we got, and to keep the local kids in line. No, we were more afraid of our mom, and how she'd tan our hides if we were late getting home. Whether or not we believed in foresters was irrelevant. She believed in them, and would accept no backtalk when it came to being home on time. We thanked Mrs. Foster and left in a hurry after saying bye to Tyler, promising we'd be back tomorrow. We hit the road running, our sneakers eating up the pavement. Tyler lived about 20 minutes from our house, a run that was nothing to a couple of kids barely into their teens. We had no doubt that we could make it before sunset, and my brother even jostled me as he invited me to race. The two of us were soon huffing and puffing as we ran, the woods on our left, as far from our minds as they could be. We were coming up the road, the sun still visible on the horizon, when Tyler noticed something weird. It was like we'd walked into a cloud, and it took us a minute to put two and two together. The fog usually waited till dark to roll in, but it could appear at any time. I remember the yard monitors pulling us off the playground last year because the fog was rolling in. The teachers had closed all the windows, and we'd held class in the shadowy room until an announcement said the fog had passed. We'd been told our whole lives not to go into the fog, but it appeared the fog had come to us. Whatever, we were like a block from the house. Come on, let's just keep going. But we aren't supposed to go into the fog, I reminded him. We're already in it now. In order to get out of it, we gotta go through it. Come on, what are you afraid of? I was hesitant, not wanting to get in trouble for breaking rules, but seeing the sense of what he was saying. I didn't really believe in foresters, no more than I believed in the boogeyman, but the rules were something I did believe in. Rules were rules, and I knew that if you broke the rules, you got punished. As a kid, you never want to get punished, but my brother was making a lot of sense, too. If we were out after dark, we'd be breaking another rule, and the after dark rule was a big one. The fog was growing dense around us now, and when I reached out for my brother's hand, he took it. He led me into the fog, and we started making our way home slowly. We knew the way home well. We'd walked it from school or from town many times, but as the fog grew thicker, it almost seemed like we were moving across alien terrain. I imagined us being transported somewhere else, like Narnia, and I was afraid that we would come out in a very different forest. I remembered wondering if there would be somewhere for us to stay and something for us to eat when we came out. That's when my brother sighed in relief. I looked up. There was something in the fog, something not too far away, and my brother had clearly thought it was someone else lost in the fog. "Hey, over here," he called. "Can you help us? We're lost in the fog." I was happy that we'd maybe found a way out, until the thing moved. When it moved, you could tell it wasn't a person. It bent too much, seeming to want to crawl on all fours. Its arms looked like they'd healed badly after being broken, and its whole body just leaned at weird angles. It was more than that, though. It's hard to explain, but seeing it move made the hair stand up on my body. It awakened something in me that I hadn't known was there, something ancient and dormant. I suddenly understood why the rules said not to run, because all I wanted to do at that moment was get as far away from that thing as I could. I had a primal urge to get away from this. I wanted to run fast as I could, that sleeping part of my brain telling me that danger was near, and the only thing I could do before being eaten was run. "Run," my brother yelled, clearly feeling the same, and the two of us took off at top speed. We ran back the way we'd come, just hoping to escape the fog and make it back to reality. We glanced behind us, checking to see if it was following, but the creature was just moving along at a leisurely pace. It was in no hurry, its movements not rushed in the least, but the farther we ran, the less distance it needed to make. The fog was limitless, the depths too deep for anything to permeate it, and I felt that ancient part of my brain start to gibber as fear overloaded it. "Why isn't it chasing us?" my brother asked, looking back over his shoulder as he ran. He was unsure of what to make of the creature, its lack of haste confusing him, and I kept looking forward as often as I looked back, hoping a second one wasn't going to rise up to hem us in. When my brother fell, I stopped and turned back to look at him. The creature was about 15 feet behind us, impossibly close. I was torn, standing as still as I could as my body and mind told me to run for my life, but another little voice told me to stay still and remember the rules. He'd twisted something, his ankle standing out at odd angles, and when he reached for me, I almost went to him. The only thing that stopped me was the incessant voice of the school assemblies, of Anti-Forester Fred, the town safety mascot, and the knowledge that if I moved, I'd be dead too. Anti-Forester Fred says if you see a forester, freeze like a statue, I mumbled. My brother was nearly howling in agony. He'd rolled onto his stomach and was looking at me from the pavement. He raised an arm, reaching pitifully for me, but his position meant that he hadn't seen the shape as it got closer and closer to him. He was calling my name, begging me to help, but all I could do was shake my head with minute little shifts and watch the forester get closer. I looked down when he cried out, his leg throbbing as he drug himself along the pavement. Help me! Help me! Don't let it get me! Come on, you know I'd help you! I looked down at him, torn between wanting to help and wanting to freeze, and the overpowering urge to simply take off like a deer being pursued by a hunter. The creature was walking, almost strolling, as it came out of the mist. It took everything I had not to flee when I saw it look my way. It was like a zombie, but so much worse. Its skin was rotten looking. Insects crawled in and out of it as it stood there, and parts of it were twisted and strange. It was missing its left leg, and a thick tree branch replaced it. Something had caved in half of its head on the left side, and the forest had made an approximation of its face out of wood, which it wore like a skull cap or a mask. Part of its left arm, part of its chest, they had all been worked through with wood, and when it bent down to grab my brother, it groaned like a tree in a high wind. He looked back when it dragged him off, and as his screams disappeared into the mist, he seemed to disappear from the world as well. I watched him go, and as he did, I sat down on the pavement and put my head between my knees. I tried to stay as still as I could, but I was sure that if any of the foresters had been close, they would have seen me trembling. I just closed my eyes and prayed that it would end, that it would all go away. And when I started to hear someone calling my name, I opened my eyes and found that I was sitting in the middle of the road, the sun still hanging on the horizon. My mother had come running up the road to find me. She wrapped me in a hug, asking where my brother was before scooping me into her arms and carrying me back to the house. According to her, it was only 8:20. My brother and I had run through the fog. He'd been taken, and I had knelt shivering in the mist for hours, while less than 10 minutes had actually passed. Rayffered isn't a large town. You can drive right through it if you aren't careful. It's been 10 years since my brother disappeared, but I think about him every day. The movie theater's still there. The diner burned down when I was a junior, and the shops on Main Street have gone from boutiques and antique stores to cell phone depots, electronic shops, thrift outlets, and the occasional knick-knack shop. The forest, however, hasn't changed at all. The forest is eternal, at least until my chainsaw has something to say about it. We cut the forest back, we logged the old trees, but we don't go near the old growth in the heart of the forest. That place is said to be haunted by the restless spirits of the loggers who came before us. The old growth was old when the first settlers cut the first trees in the Rayffered woods. A few of the older loggers claim to have been there, seen the place, but say it's best not to go close to dark. You gotta have your wits about you if you go there, and you never want to be in the woods after the sun goes down, they say. I'd always figured I'd leave Rayffered like most of the young people do, but it seems the young people who stay have lost people to the foresters as well. Mothers, daughters, husbands, fathers, sons, cousins, it doesn't matter. It binds the community together, draws us close, makes us hope that someday the foresters might bring them back. I have a little more hope than that. I mean to make them bring my brother back. It's taken me 10 years to get out of town and into the old woods. I will make my way to the old growth. I will find out where the foresters live. I will find my brother again. I was weak when they took him, but now I can do more than cower on the hot top as they drag him off into the woods. So some of you have asked me why it took me 2 years to take up the family business. Dad had been a member of Camber & Sons logging outfit since I was born, and it should have been easy to get a job with them. Dad would have likely been overjoyed to have me come to work with him, but I had other ideas. I, like many others before me, had tried to escape Rayffered as soon as I was able. After 3 years of ROTC and nearly constant pushing to get the credits I needed, I was eligible for early graduation. I would turn 18 in May, a few weeks after school ended for the year, and I took the opportunity to move on to the next stage of my life. With my grades, my ASVAB score, and participation in ROTC, I was also offered an invitation to join the Army, and I left on a 2-year tour of duty after basic. This was during a time when the armed forces were still heavily entrenched in the Middle East, and I took up my rifle and had soon forgotten about foresters and Rayffered and the concerns of my childhood. I was going out with my unit every day, patrolling and securing sites, but it appeared that my childhood hadn't quite forgotten about me. About a week after I turned 20, the dreams started. I was back in Rayffered, standing amidst the fog. I was 10 years old, sitting on the pavement and shuddering in fear. This time, there wasn't just one forester, though. There were hundreds. They came shambling out of the fog, scraping the pavement and groaning as their bodies twisted and writhed. They surrounded me, ringing me in as they pushed closer and closer. One of them shambled his way to the front, his form obscured by the fog, but I felt like I knew who it was. There was only one person it could be for me, and as they leered at me from the depths of the miasma, I would come awake fitfully, sometimes waking up my fellow bunkmates. It would take a week of inadequate sleep before the strain finally got to me, and it ended up saving my life. I was driving through the pitted streets of Fallujah, my unit heading to investigate a couple of suspected gathering places for rebel rousers, when someone ran across the road. What I saw was a gangling kid in blue shorts with a backwards cap, a kid who looked a lot like my brother had before being drug off, and when I turned the wheel to avoid him, everything went white before going black for a little while. We had hit an incendiary device buried by insurgents, but we hadn't hit it square. We had clipped it in our haste, and it had flipped the Humvee we'd been riding in. We'd been rolled into a nearby ditch. Briggs, the medic on board, had called for support, and only me and a couple of others had been injured at all. I'd taken a hit to the head when it slammed into the side of a door, and the docs thought I might have brain damage. That and the explosion left me in the hospital for a few weeks, and when someone from HR came to speak with me, I knew it wasn't good. The medics say you have something going on after the crash. It isn't life-threatening, but they don't know how a combat situation would affect it. Your quick thinking might have possibly saved the lives of your squad, and the brass is willing to reward that. They want to offer you a medical discharge with full compensation. This'll get you your service benefits and the same care as a 4-year enlistee. They also want to offer you a Medal of Valor for what you did out there. I don't know how you feel about your service career, but I think you'd be a fool not to accept it. So they offered me a Medal of Valor for nearly falling asleep at the wheel and swerving to avoid a hallucination. My squad thought I had seen nothing in the road, but They all thought it had been a lump or a divot that didn't look right. None of them had seen anyone dart out across the street, and when I suggested it, they told me to stop being modest. The other 2 injured soldiers were discharged pretty quick, and I packed my stuff and prepared to go home. After the dreams and seeing my older brother in a foreign land, I was pretty sure I could take these things as a sign that something wanted me back in Rayffered. Given my dreams, I wasn't sure it was an invitation I wanted to accept. But I returned to Rayffered anyway, and the town rolled out the red carpet for me. Rayffered is a town of about 55,000, and they don't have a lot of heroes. Well, other than the brave loggers who head into the forest every day, knowing what lives there. It was weird to come back to a place I had thought I'd left behind, especially as a hero of sorts. I had looked at the statue of the 2 guys who died in Korea about 100 times as a kid. It was weird to think that I might be on their level. Rayffered had mostly been immune to wars ever since the Civil War, and the few who had been enlisted hadn't really made much of an impression. Then the Talbert twins had enlisted to go to Korea. They had died heroically, holding a hill in an unpronounceable province for 6 days. They nearly lasted till reinforcements arrived, but the chopper found them both dead in the gun nest they occupied. The town had memorialized them in granite, and it was strange to be counted amongst them. I spent my first week walking around like a celebrity. My old high school friends who still lived in town invited me to parties. People paid for my meals at restaurants. I was treated better than I had been in years, but just because I was home didn't mean that the dreams stopped. If anything, they only got worse. I was no longer sitting on the hot top and waiting for the foresters. No, I was hoofing it through a war zone. My gun was heavy, my undershirt stuck to me from beneath my flak jacket, but the enemies that reared up were the creaking shades of the foresters. The wooded bits of them seemed to writhe behind the standing smog that permeated everything. No matter how many times I shot them, they always seemed to pop back up. I would always wake up just as a familiar shape rose up behind the smog, the barrel shaking as I came awake. I didn't know what to make of them until Friday night found me at a party. My friend Frank was throwing a house party, and he couldn't think of anyone better to have there but a genuine war hero. "You'll be there, right?" he said, and it was pretty clear that he had told people I would be. Friday night saw me sitting in his parents' kitchen, drinking a lukewarm beer and talking with people that I hadn't seen in 3 years. Most of them had either never left or had never been farther from the city limits than a few hours. I was honestly finding it hard to relate to them. The more people I talked to, the more I questioned why I was still here at all. Was this my life now? Living with my parents and working some dead-end job in a town that was shrinking yearly as the forest threatened to reclaim it? I smiled at my old friends and laughed at their stories or commiserated with their losses, but I was honestly debating taking my house budget and going anywhere but Rayffered. Then, someone put a hand on my shoulder, and I looked up to see the last person I had expected. "Haven't seen you in a while, Rambo. Glad you made it back alive." It was Tyler, and his smile looked as hollow as my own. We sat around and talked a lot that night as bottles piled up, and we both shared a little more than we meant to. Tyler had been struggling since high school. His dad's grocery store was doing well, but Tyler wasn't ready to take it from him. The decision, however, seemed to be out of his hands. The doctors had told his dad he had cancer a few months ago, the kind that creeps in fast and doesn't leave a lot of time for goodbyes. His dad was stage 3 now, practically sprinting to the finish line, and Dr. John had given him weeks instead of months. The shit of it is that Dad never smoked, never did any of the things that usually lead to cancer. So when he started looking into how he had contracted such an aggressive type, they found it was the chemicals on the vegetables that he stocked from the local farms. They'd been spraying their produce with something to get rid of the wood beetles, and Dad had been coming into contact with it for years. The business literally killed him, and now he wants me to take it up. How do I tell my old man as he lays dying that I don't want to take up a mantle that put him in an early grave? I didn't have any answers for him, and we both just sat there in silence as people milled about us. Times like this make me think about Simon. I looked away, not sure when we were going to come to this topic of my brother. I still feel guilty about that day. I keep wondering what I could have done to nothing. I cut in. There's nothing you could have done. I've told you this for years. It was a fluke. There isn't anything anyone could have done. Suddenly it was all too much. The crowd, the music, the sea of familiar faces that suddenly swam together in a sea of booze. It was all too much. I had planned to crash at Frank's after the party, the rules of the town still applying to heroes, but I just couldn't. I got up, heading for the door, when Tyler called my name and told me the Forresters would get me if I went out. I've spent 3 years in an active war zone, Tyler. I think I can make it home in one piece, in a town I grew up in. No one seemed to notice as I walked out the door, and it wasn't until I started walking through the night that I began to think better of it. The night was quiet, not a bat or a night bird making a single noise, and it felt a little claustrophobic. Even in the desert there had been noise, but this almost felt like a truly foreign place. The wind pushed at the trees, the sudden intrusion of the skeletal brush across the concrete as unwelcome as the silence. I was about halfway home when the overwhelming urge to empty my bladder hit, and I was forced to find a bush along the side of the road. I was beginning to sober up, starting to worry that maybe I'd been a little too brash, when I noticed the fog rolling in around my ankles. I tried to hurry, wanting to hurry up so as to keep moving, but I had drank about a 10-pack all by myself, and when I zipped up and turned around, I was back in the fog bank. The mist was thick as it swirled around me, leaving me alone in the haze. As I watched, something shadowy moved amidst the fog, and I tried my best to stand completely still. I wasn't 10 anymore, and I meant to fight if this thing wanted me. I wouldn't be the first adult to go missing thanks to the Forresters. It wasn't the huge group I'd expected, though, but a single Forrester, like the dreams I'd been having recently. As it moved, I got none of the usual apprehension I'd had when I was young. The Forrester wasn't as old, wasn't as degraded as the others, and its gait was unmarred by haste or hunger or whatever it was that moved them. The soft clump of wood on the road, however, was enough to tell me that some parts of it were less than natural. I stayed completely still as it came closer and closer, the mist obscuring all but its dark outline. Would it lunge and take me in a tackle? Would it disappear at the last minute and leave me trembling in the mist that I had been in when I was younger? Was it distracting me so another one could creep up behind me and get me? I didn't dare take my eyes off to look. I just watched as it came within 5 easy feet of me, knowing who it was before it uttered a single word. "Old Grove," it creaked. Its voice was like pines bending in the wind. "Simon?" I half whispered, and the thing stiffened as if it had heard something from a life 1,000,000 years ago. "Old Grove. Seek the heart at the old grove." Then it disappeared into the mist, a phantom that moved amidst the vapor, and I was left standing there with my fly down, thinking about my next move. Dad was overjoyed when I asked if Camber and Son was hiring the next morning. "Would you really want to work in the forest with your old man?" he said hopefully. "You don't think the chainsaw and the fallen trees would mess with your, whatever it is you got going on?" "Nah, Dad, I don't think it will. Besides, I need some income if I'm gonna get my own place. Can't live in Mommy and Daddy's house forever." I hadn't told them about the housing bonus the Army sent me every month. The money was not my objective, nor the reason I wanted to go into the woods. Camber and Son cut the woods back from the town itself, but they also went the deepest, and sometimes went as far as the borders to the old grove, the spot where the Forresters were said to make their home. Camber and Sons were my best chance of finding out what had taken Simon. They were my best chance of seeing my brother again, in whatever form he might have taken now. Camber and Sons was indeed glad to see me. The interview process was pretty straightforward. I had been swinging an axe since I was a kid, and logging was basically a historical course for us at school. The teachers knew when many of us graduated, we'd be going into the logging trade. Rayffered only had one real industry, after all. We learned from a young age how to keep the forest at bay, how to use the woods to further the growth of the town, and how to avoid the foresters. I tried to pay attention to Wendell Camber, the current Camber of Camber and Sons, as he asked me about my time in the war, but my eyes kept going back to the poster behind his desk, the one of the shadowy figures that lumbered the streets by night. Beware the foresters, it said, and follow all the rules set by the town elders. This was something we had all grown up with, and it was a sign that I'd seen since my earliest time in school. "Sorry," Wendell said, after the third time I'd gotten distracted. "I know the war is probably a sore subject. I was just curious. I didn't mean any disrespect." "None taken," I said simply. "I guess I'm still a little shell-shocked. I think I really just need something to occupy my time. Being still makes me pretty anxious, and an anxious soldier is waiting for an accident." Wendell laughed, nodding like he understood completely. "I can understand that. Hell, I spent my last vacation waiting for it to be over. Sometimes the woods just call to you, and it's hard to ignore that call." He looked towards the little window of the trailer that his office had, and I was sure that he was hearing the call of something. "Anyway, your dad tells me that you've got some kind of injury in the service." He tapped the side of his head. "Anything that might make the job difficult?" I shook my head. Truth be told, I think I would have been fine to return to combat, but the docs didn't want to risk it. Loud noises don't bother me, neither does a hard day's work for long hours. "And foresters?" he asked, looking over the clipboard with a questioning look. "What about 'em?" I said, preparing for the coming question. "I know they took your brother. Any lingering animosity?" I had to work hard not to laugh at him. Lingering animosity? They had taken my older brother, and I suspected that they may have made him like them. Lingering animosity. Yeah, I suppose there was some of that, but I didn't want to tell that to Wendell Camber. Wendell Camber would likely know a little something about lingering animosity, since the foresters had taken two of his cousins and his father a couple of years before. His dad, Joseph Camber, had been sick and dying of the same aggressive cancer that was taking Tyler's dad, and his time was getting short. The scuttlebutt was that he had been staring at the woods from the back porch of his house, and his wife had found the back door open in his clothes on the backyard grass. He had never been seen again, but Wendell was still hopeful that they would stumble across his remains. "That's ancient history now," I assured him. "Besides, what would I do if hard feelings did persist? The foresters are undying. How exactly would I do anything to them in the first place?" He nodded, apparently satisfied with the answer. "Well, the work ain't glamorous, but it's honest work. We work Monday through Friday, sun up to about an hour before sunset. We have optional work on Saturdays. Sundays are always an off day, in case you want to go to church or something. We have a position open with Garza's crew if you're interested. You can start tomorrow, if you like, in fact." We discussed pay, I signed some contracts, and then we sealed it with a handshake. And just like that, I was a logger. Dad was all smiles when he came home, and when he brought me a care package after dinner, I suspected that I knew what was in it. It's one of my old jumpsuits and a harness, some work gloves, a hard hat. The boots, he said as he pitched his voice low, are new, however. Don't tell your mother. She wanted me to give you an old pair of mine. I thanked him, my desert boots looking a little ragged next to the thick brown work boots that Dad had put at the bottom of the package. I always hoped that one of you boys would join me in the woods, he said, sounding a little teary-eyed. I honestly felt a little selfish for it, though. I was hoping both of you would do better than your old man, but after Simon was... He stopped then, trying to compose himself, but put a hand on his shoulder. I know, Dad. Thank you for the gear. It'll make me look like less of a greenhorn than I am, I said with a laugh. Learn everything you can from Garza, he said with a smile. I would have liked to have had you in Garrett's crew, but you could do far worse than Garza's bunch. He's a tough supervisor, but he cares for his guys, and he teaches them right. Learn everything you can. Work hard, and you'll get everything you put into this job. He was so proud of me as he walked off, telling me to get some sleep since I had a big day tomorrow. I almost wanted to call him back and tell him what I was planning, ask him on his opinion on trying to get Simon back. I couldn't do that to him, though. Dad had waited years for this, and if he knew my plans, then he would make it that much harder for me to get into his crew. The outfit my dad was with went the deepest, deeper than any of the others, and if I was going to get to the Grove, then I would need to sign on with one of those guys. They wouldn't sign on a greenhorn to go into the deep woods, and I knew that I was going to be working the outskirts to start with. After some time, they might ask me if I wanted to join one of the bigger crews, but for now, I needed to impress Garza and learn as much as I could. Impressing my new boss, however, wouldn't prove as hard as I thought. I arrived at the lumber yard just after first light the next day, my coffee in one hand and my lunchbox in the other. Dad had rummaged out one of his old boxes, and I had a carabiner on it so that I could hook it to my harness if I needed to. Some old-timers were keeping a wary eye peeled, but most of the loggers were just now showing up. We started to filter off into smaller groups, and Dad patted my shoulder as he pointed me to a small group by the foreman's shack. I believe that's your crew. Good luck, son. He moved off, waving at some of his crewmates, and I went to stand with the small group of greenhorns. Most of them were as new to this as I was, and I saw a lot of fresh jumpsuits and nervous talk. This was a lot like the first day of school before you make friends or join teams and clubs, and I was waiting for someone to make the first move. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little nervous, as strange as that sounds, given that I'd just come from an active war zone. Sometimes the unknown is scarier than any war, and I was getting ready to head into the truest unknown. One of the old-timers walked over, and I could tell by his stride and the way that he held himself that I wasn't the only one who'd spent some time in the service. "Okay, boys," the man said, his name stitch indicating him as Garza. "Grab your gear and let's head out. Oh," he said, noticing me, "suppose we got a new face. Make him feel welcome. Show him where his stuff is. Derek," he said. One of the others stopped to look at him. "Show him the ropes. Show him where Tank's stuff is. It's his now." Derek nodded, offering me a hand as we headed towards the shed. "You the war hero?" he asked, as he took me to a cubby with equipment in it, and my name hastily taped across the top. "I'm no hero. I was in the army, though. My squad used to call me Wood since I told them I came from the forest, so I guess you guys can call me that too if you like." "Cool. You can take Tank's old stuff. He won't be needing it anymore," he said with a little sigh. There was an axe, a tool belt, a chainsaw, and an assortment of saws in a bag. The chainsaw was already gassed up, and the stuff looked brand new. The belt was barely stained, the tools were still shiny, and I wondered how long Tank had been with the outfit. Furthermore, I wondered why Tank had left the outfit, and if it was entirely his idea. "So what happened to Tank?" I asked, as I hooked on the gear. "He move or something?" Derek sucked in his cheeks, but he knew it wouldn't do any good to pussyfoot around it. "Forrester's got him. We found his belt at the wood line, and that's the only reason you got it." I blew out of breath, feeling like I should have guessed. "Shit, sorry, man, I wasn't thinking." Derek brightened a little, slapping me lightly on the back. "Not your fault, Wood. Come on, Garza usually likes to leave before it gets too late." We piled into the back of the truck, the six of us making a tight fit with our gear, and away we went. We stopped in a sleepy suburb, and as the boss climbed out, we all climbed out to get our assignments. The neighborhood looked abandoned, the trees growing up as close as they dared, and it was clear they dared a lot. Some of the houses had trees growing inside them, the backyards looking like small forests themselves, and I doubted that we would disturb anyone with our cutting. City wants us to cut the woods back here, make the neighborhood livable again. If the trees are in the yards, we cut them down without damaging the houses. If they're in the houses, mark the door with a red X and move on. The houses are not as important to the city as cutting the trees back. We're shooting for 3 days, so watch for fog and keep an eye on the sun. We broke off into pairs, and Derek and I set to cutting back the thick brush around several of the houses close to the work truck. The others spread out in a haphazard pattern as they used their chainsaws to trim back the greenery, pushing it back into the forest. The woods looked foreboding, the pavement starting to show cracks as the roots poked free. The trees here were young, barely more than saplings, but they'd pushed their way into the urban space with little effort. I'd never seen the trees get this close, but I knew that there were several lumber outfits in town, and all of them were on retainer when it came to keeping the woods cut back. "This is really about all we do," Derek said over the sound of his chainsaw as I pushed a small tree down. "I've been with the outfit for a year, and we've cut this neighborhood back at least once before." "How do they grow so fast?" I asked, pushing the small tree with my foot as we stacked them. "No one knows," Derek said, as he slid binders around the stack. "They just do. The forest wants the town pretty badly. Seems like all we do is try to keep it back." By lunchtime, we had a tidy pile of young-growth trees, and as we munched our sandwiches and wraps and such, I asked why we use chainsaws to keep the forest back. "What you mean?" Derek asked, spraying chip crumbs. "What else would we use?" "I mean, why not burn back the forest?" I asked, thinking of watching the fire consume the sea of green that had threatened us. Derek coughed like he'd been punched in the guts, and the others looked worried like my idea might be catching. "Wood? You can't use fire in the woods. Everyone knows that." "Why not?" I asked. "'Cause it attracts the foresters," came a deep voice from my left. Garza had set up a chair under the shade of a carport, and he came towards our group as he chewed his po' boy. He didn't look pleased with our line of discussion and wanted to squash it. "Didn't they teach you why you don't use fire in the forest in school? It's been tried more than a few times, and it never ends well. The fire seems to make the foresters angry, and the fog rolls in to stop it. Anyone around the fire is never seen again, and the damage seems to disappear once the fire's gone. I would have thought your father would have told you about the dangers of fire. He was involved in the 95 burning near the deep woods." I shook my head, unable to take my eyes off the grizzled logger as he continued. "There's always someone who thinks they know best, but they usually just lead to a lot of strife and a lot of openings at whatever company they're working for. We use the tools that we've always used, and we do the best that we can to keep the forest at bay. Speaking of, lunch is passed over. Time to get back to work." He went back to the overhang to get his gear, and as we moved off to the adjacent yard, we all cleaned up our mess and followed suit. By the end of the first day, I was tired. It was nice to have full-time work again. It felt like a while since I'd done anything worthwhile, and as I put my chainsaw in the back of the truck, I felt a sense of fulfillment wash through me. I could do this. I could work my way up through the ranks and get to the grove. Derek had told me that we'd made a lot of progress as the boss called an end of the day, and I was excited to see what tomorrow would bring. I was climbing into the back of the truck when Garza called me by name. "Ride in the cab with me. I want a word." Everyone looked at me like I'd done something wrong, and as I climbed in and shut the door, I was worried I was about to come in for an ass chewing. We were driving away from the site, and when he rumbled out laughter, I realized I must have looked worried. "Don't fret, son. This ain't a dressing down. I just wanted to talk to you and see how your first day went. You're a hard worker, which is more than I can say for Some of the old-timers, kids. It's good to have you on the crew." I breathed a sigh of relief as I realized that this was a getting-to-know-my-employees kind of talk. It was fine. It was nice to get back out there and do some work again. I'd been feeling like a couch potato since I got home. Ah, yes. It's always hard to return to civilian life, especially after you've been in the thick of it. Your dad says you were in the Army. I was in the Marines, and it was hard to find my niche after Vietnam. I perked up a little after finding out he was a combat vet. "You were in Vietnam?" "2 tours. At the start of the war, and then again towards the end, right before we pulled out. It was a senseless war, but I never regretted my service. Cutting trees is definitely a little different from an active combat zone." "Oh, not as different as you'd think, especially around here. There are enemies to keep an eye on, objectives to obtain. The forest is an enemy that we beat our heads against ceaselessly. It's a war that we'll never win, no matter how hard we fight. We can only hold back the inevitable and hope to keep people safe." One of the guys in the back laughed, and Garza glanced back at the 5 young guys in the truck bed with something almost fatherly. "Jameson back there was in the Navy, you know. Served on a ship about the same time you did. He did his 4 years and decided to come cut trees instead of working the flight deck. Ramsey was in Desert Storm, though he probably doesn't look old enough to have been alive then. Your new friend Derek is a boot camp washout, and he had some pretty bad asthma as a kid. It's a wonder he made it through the physical fitness portion. Clancy's an active guardsman, goes out on maneuvers a couple of times a year, does his training most weekends." I couldn't help but chuckle as I looked back at the old Marine. "You seem to have quite a collection of military excellence here." He gave me a hard look as if he was trying to decide whether I was mocking his crew or not, but must have decided I was just poking fun. "I try my best to get the ex-military guys, give them a quiet place to land, but it's more than that. I feel like it's my duty to keep them safe, keep them secure, at least until they're ready to watch for themselves. The woods are dangerous, I think all of them know that, but they're used to being able to fight off that danger. Most of them had never encountered a forester, not like you and I have, and they don't understand that it isn't an enemy that can be fought." My ears perked up a little at that. "You've seen one too, then?" Garza nodded. "Maybe I'll tell you about it sometime. It's probably the reason I ended up going into the service, the desire to save people." We were getting close to the lumber yard now, and as we pulled in, I felt good about the group. I'd found myself a home, it seemed. In many ways, it was like being back with my squad in the sandbox. "Before you go," he said, the others piling out of the truck as it came to rest, "I want to tell you that the fire discussion wasn't meant to make you feel singled out. I thought everyone knew not to use fire near the woods, and I wanted to put any thoughts of using it out of your mind. It's a tool that can easily get out of control, but it's also something that seems to make the foresters furious. Your dad and I saw that firsthand in '95, and I don't ever want to see something like that again." I nodded, knowing better now. "What happened?" I said, before I could stop myself. I didn't think he was going to answer for a minute, but when he did, I wished I hadn't asked. "Your dad and I ran for our lives, that's what happened. We ran, and we didn't look back. Somehow we made it out alive. We're the only ones who did, and I think they were more interested in getting the person who'd set the fire than us. Something I don't like to think about, but it's something I dream about pretty often." We sat there for a few minutes, just listening to the truck tick, before I said I'd see him tomorrow and went to get my gear. That was my first day with Camber and Son, and with a group of roughnecks I would come to be very close with. It was my first day, but far from my last. When the doorbell rang, I grabbed the bowl and headed for the front. I could see the silhouettes of the 3 small forms through the glass front of the door, one of them wearing the noticeable cone of a witch's hat. It was Halloween, and even in Rayffered, that meant that the kids hit the street in search of sweet confections. Mom and Dad were still getting their costumes on, Marge and Homer Simpson this year, and I didn't have the heart to tell Dad that the costume was spot on for him. Until they got ready, however, I was on door duty. I shaded my eyes a little as I opened the front door, the mid-afternoon sun the only contrast in a normal Halloween. In Rayffered, everybody had to be back after sundown, so if you wanted to trick-or-treat, you had to get your candy before the sun went down. "Trick-or-treat," the kids called, holding their bags out and shaking them. I grinned as I filled the bags of a little witch and her friends, a vampire, and a ninja. I remembered when my brother and I had hit the streets after school, with our bags in hand and a close eye on the time. We didn't really believe in the foresters back then, but we knew that Mom would tan our hides if we got back a second after sundown. I also remember watching kids trick-or-treat after my brother went missing, some of the magic gone now that I knew the monsters were a fact. Most of the people I'd talked to outside the town thought it was weird that we hit the streets before sunset, but I suppose other places didn't have to worry about shambling monsters coming from the woods. As the kids headed off, I heard my dad chuckle and realized he'd been watching. "Little different from your last Halloween?" "Well, the guys going door to door last year were looking for wounded soldiers to put out of their misery, so, nah, pretty much the same, I guess." Dad looked like he wasn't sure whether to laugh or not, and as Mom came in, her wig slightly askew, I handed her the bowl and told them to have fun. "Sure you won't stay and hand out candy?" she asked. "I think we have your old Bart costume from a few years ago." "Hard pass, Mom. Some of the guys from work want to go celebrate a little before the sun sets, and I told them I'd meet them at Lafferty's." Mom's face told me all I needed to know about that, but Dad nodded as if this was as common as dinner in a movie. Lafferty's was one of the nicer bars that catered to the loggers in the community. If you were just looking for a dive to drink in, you went to the Red Pine, but Lafferty could usually be counted on to have as few fights as possible and very little chance of contracting something if you decided to take the local barfly home. "Are you planning to drive?" Mom asked, clearly not sure which answer she was hoping for. She seemed to like the idea of me stumbling home drunk near dark less than the idea of me wrapping my car around a tree. "Nope, thought I'd walk," I said. "It's only about a 20-minute slog." "Well, be careful," Dad said, the doorbell turning their attention away. "Is Garza going drinking with you guys?" He pitched his voice a little low as he said it. I shook my head. "Nah, Derek says he doesn't drink much. The other guys want to go out and tie a few on and take advantage of the long weekend." Halloween had fallen on a Friday, so we essentially had a long weekend since we knocked off at 2 that day. "Well, have fun," Dad said, and as the kids dispersed with their treats, I followed behind them and headed towards town. The streets were packed with kids in costumes, and it was pretty clear that some of them had gone from school to trick-or-treating. Most of them had probably worn their costumes to school anyway, and put their pillowcases in their backpack for later. As I walked, the cloud of costumed children parted for me, the giggling swarms of superheroes and princesses, football stars and fantasy characters as thick as mosquitoes that still held court this close to winter. Summer had held in for longer than usual this year, and I wasn't looking forward to having to cut back trees in the freezing wind. Dad had already warned me that this would likely be the last warm weekend until May, and I should enjoy it while it lasted. I'd spent 2 years in the heat, and I was both looking forward to the cold and dreading it. As I walked the familiar sidewalks into town, it was hard not to keep an eye peeled for fog encroaching. In Rayffered, every day felt a little like Halloween, and the knowledge that shambling horrors could come up from a fog bank at any minute was spooky enough. The older I got, the less I understood why anybody chose to live here. But I suppose every small town has its problems. Some places have nuclear waste, some towns have aggressive wildlife, and Rayffered has terrifying creatures that come from the woods. As the town came into sight, I couldn't help but take in the holiday plumage of Rayffered. The hardware store had 5 different jack-o'-lantern trees, which are just 3 jacks stacked on top of each other, and a swarm of furry bats hanging on the railing of the overhang. The post office had a black and red mural declaring the holiday, and a collection of jack-o'-lanterns on the stoop. The lawn of the city hall had a half a dozen of those inflatable Halloween characters from the Home Depot, and a 12-foot-tall posable skeleton that they had dressed up like Paul Bunyan, complete with flannel shirt and beard. Between them was something like 30 carved pumpkin faces, the city landmarks marking them, and their candles danced mutely in the afternoon light. I had to wonder how much of that had come at the taxpayers' expense, but it was hard not to be a little impressed by the spectacle. When someone called my name from across the street, I looked up to see Susan standing in front of the used bookstore, waving at me. She was dressed in an intricate little Bo Peep costume, complete with crook and a stuffed lamb. "Happy Halloween! Haven't seen you since the party," she said, rattling a half-full bucket of candy at me. I smiled, taking some Jolly Ranchers. "Yeah, been working at Camber & Son since I got back. It's been pretty busy." She smiled knowingly. "Like father, like son, I suppose. You should come by the shop sometime. Maybe invite a girl out for coffee." I smiled. I didn't figure she'd be interested in being seen with a dirty logger like me. "She could do a lot worse, I'm sure," Susan retorted. A group of kids wandered up then, squealing about Miss Sue, and she reminded me to come and see her at Wormwood Books sometimes. Despite myself, I thought I might as I made my way to Lafferty's. I haven't mentioned Susan yet, but it's not because she isn't important. Susan and I grew up together, went through every grade except senior year together, and she was the closest thing I think I ever had to a stable relationship. I think she believed that she could change my plans about moving out of Rayffered, and when they finally came to pass, it made her a little angry. I told her I wasn't trying to escape her, but rather trying to escape the ghost of my brother and the shadows of the Foresters. We see how well that worked out, I guess. If she wanted to talk about old times, I supposed I could meet her for some coffee, but I'd have to keep an eye on the mission ahead. I wouldn't hurt her again by giving her false hope. She hadn't been allowed to keep me after high school, and she couldn't keep me now either. I was likely walking to my death when it was all said and done, and I didn't want to leave her behind and hurting again. My smile had evaporated by the time I got to Lafferty's, and the guys all cheered as I came in. "About time you showed up. We thought the Foresters had gotten you," Derek said, calling for another pitcher as I took a seat with them. They had left a seat at the head of the table for the boss, if he should decide to join us, and it was almost like you could feel his presence there. I suppose it would be fitting to have a spirit at the table, even if it was the spirit of someone living. The table was covered in bottles already, and by some of their faces, I thought they may have started earlier than we had planned. Derek had been joined by Jordan and Michael from a different crew, and Jameson and Clancy had come out as well. Ramsey had opted out so he could take his grandkids trick-or-treating, and the 4 of them seemed to be trying to drink enough for Ramsey and Garza. I was mindful of how much I let them slide my way, but after an hour or so and several pitchers, I was feeling a little tipsy, too. "Did you guys hear what happened to Daryl's crew yesterday?" Jordan asked suddenly. "Nah," Derek said, dropping his bottle on the table a little harder than he strictly needed to after draining it. "I knew they came back to the yard super late. Well, he says they got caught in a fog bank." "No way," Clancy breathed. Did they all make it back?" "Yeah," Jordan said, "but Daryl's talking about quitting. I think it was his first real encounter with the Foresters, and it shook him. He sat right there on that stool and told me the whole thing," he said as he pointed over to the bar, "and his hands were shaking too bad to drink for the first couple of minutes." We all leaned in, prompting him to tell the story, and Jordan seemed willing to oblige. He said they were cutting new growth by the old schoolhouse when someone accidentally set a fire. "What?" Jameson said, turning his head quick enough that I thought he might pop a tendon. "How does one accidentally set a fire?" "Well," Jordan continued, "he said that Gabriel, the kid that's always wearing the orange beanie, tossed his ciggy a little too close to some dry leaves, and it caught before any of them could catch it. Daryl said that one minute they were hacking back gnarled old oaks and snaky pulp trees when the smoke hit them and they turned to find a 2-alarm fire going off in the dry leaves." "Did they get it out?" Derek asked, some of the buzz leaving his eyes. "Yeah, but it spread to the tree line before they could get enough water and dirt on it. He said they dropped their chainsaws and axes and immediately started flinging dirt on the blaze and upended the water keg over it. When it finally came down to nothing but smoke, they all breathed a sigh of relief. When the fog rolled in, they thought it was just residual smoke from the blaze. When it got thicker, they all knew what it was and knew they weren't the only ones who had seen the fire." "Shit," Derek breathed. "What did they do?" "What do you think they did?" Jordan said. "They hid. They jumped into the truck. They climbed in the cab. They got under the truck. They got as still as they could. Daryl said he watched from beneath the F-250 as the fog flowed over the job site like a living thing. When the leaves and branches began to break, he knew the foresters couldn't be far behind. From there, he also saw something that filled him with a different kind of dread." Jordan paused for dramatic effect, like he was talking about a story on TV and not the lives of 5 men, before he dropped the final bombshell. It was the slow glow of a fire deep in a nearby pile of leaves. It was likely the catalyst for the fire that had caused it all, and all the dirt and water they had put down had never touched it. Now it was going to start anew, and with the foresters so close, there was nothing they could do about it. Everyone sat back a little, letting it sink in. I still didn't know what the problem was with fire, other than that the foresters hated it. But that was all I needed to know to understand the story. Garza had told me about a tragedy that had taken the lives of he and my dad's old crew, and I knew it had something to do with a fire that had been too close to the old growth where the foresters lived. It appeared that a fire anywhere near the woods was a problem, though, and I wondered how Daryl and his crew were going to make it out. Daryl said they came lumbering out of the woods like living corpses, and the mist only did so much to cover them. He could see their gray skin with brown mixed among it, with scabby flesh and wooden workings that had made their way into them, and he was afraid the fire might be the death of them. He counted a dozen of them, men, women, and children too, and as they spread out, he said he was afraid to breathe too deeply. He could hear Gabriel beside him, praying softly, and while he hoped that something would save them from this, he put a finger to his lips to tell him to quiet down. The foresters were moving around in an agitated stomp, their heads creaking as they turned to look for the source of the fire. They were making this weird noise like tree limbs in a high wind, and Daryl was sure that they'd find them at any minute and drag them off. He paused to weigh the room, clearly liking how drawn in they all were. And all the while, the little fire was building in that pile of leaves. Daryl could see the smoke beginning to curl, and he just knows that when the foresters see it, there's gonna be hell to pay. The leaves are curling, the fire's growing bigger, and Daryl can't do anything but watch it. The slightest move, the slightest noise, and they'll know he's here and snatch him. He knows this, like all children know this, but he's caught between a rock and a hard place. They're getting close to the truck now, which is something he missed while watching the fire grow, and he's worried that the jig is up. They've smelled them. They know who started the fire. Gabriel's crying now, but he's got his hands over his mouth to try to keep it silent. Both of them are getting ready to run, knowing they won't get away, but not wanting to just get grabbed. And that's when it happened. He slammed his fist down on the table, making us all jump. One huge stomp of a foot comes down on the smoking pile of leaves, and as it comes back up, the blaze is smashed out before it can ever begin. Daryl said he was holding his breath the whole time, certain this would be when they got him. But then they moved off with the fog, the troop leaving with him as they went back into the woods. They sat still like that for a few more minutes, not daring to move, but when they heard the truck groan to life, he and Gabriel rolled from beneath it and squeezed into the cab. Those in the back stayed low as they rolled off, leaving the gear behind. None of them cared if it was there the next day or not. They were just happy to have made it out alive. The whole table was silent as the story ended, and I thought Derek might not be the only one beginning to sober up. The sun was making a bright line across the sky, and I wondered how long we'd been sitting here listening to Jordan's story. A look at my watch told me it was pushing 7, and when I got up, I felt my legs wobble a little as the beer caught up with me. I'm gonna call it a night, boys. Gotta get home before sunset. Yeah, Derek said. Yeah, we better get home before the real spooks come out. The others made similar excuses, and we settled up and moved to the parking lot. Most of us had walked, and those who hadn't decided that they would tonight. We all said our goodbyes, and as we moved off, I could feel the night creeping up on me like a velvet curtain. A curtain that meant to drop on me and pin me down. I still had about 20 or 30 minutes before true dusk, but that wasn't much of a comfort. It always reminded me of the time that I'd thought my brother and I could make it home before dark, and how disastrous that had gone. I supposed it always would. The sidewalks were a little less crowded now, and there was no Susan to greet me this time. She, much like the other shop owners who had handed out candy, had rolled up their wares and gone inside. The streets were pretty dead now, the last kid heading for home, and I quickened my pace as I came back into the neighborhood. When a pocket of mist crossed my path, I felt my breath stick in my throat. It lazed across the road from one of the nearby houses, and I froze in place as I saw it. I looked and realized how close it was to dark, my teeth clacking without permission. If I let the mist stop me, I'd be stuck out here after dark, and if that was the case, I'd have to stay on the sidewalk for the night, or risk a run home. The mist wasn't thick yet, just an inkling of what I'd seen in my youth, but as I watched, I could already see a smoky figure moving through it. They were getting close to me, their walk a little less stilted than the others, and I wondered if maybe this forester was fresher than his kin. I stood stock still as it moved towards me, but when it broke the mist, I breathed a sigh of relief. The man was dressed as a vampire, his mouth still dribbled with fake blood, and as he came out of the fog bank, he jumped a little when he noticed me. "Jesus, you scared me half to death. I thought you might be a forester, though," he said it as he looked at the growing smoke. "I suppose you might have thought the same." "Yeah," I laughed, breathing out a sigh of relief. "What's with all the fog?" He laughed. "Sorry, the wife is a witch, and she was using the dry ice to make her cauldron smoke. It wasn't until I dumped it in the yard that I realized how much smoke it was making." He reached into the mailbox, taking out a few envelopes before wishing me a happy Halloween and walking back into the dissipating fog bank. I watched him go, glad that it had been nothing, but realizing how low the sun was getting and picking up my pace as I headed for home. No need to tempt fate on a night like tonight. It was Saturday, and I had decided to use my weekend to do some research. I've been working for Camber & Son for about a month now, but it seemed like I'd been there no time at all some days. Have you ever had a job where you just instantly mesh with the people there? You find yourself forming inside jokes, easily forming friendships, without any real effort, maybe even feeling like you've always been there. That was how I felt while I was on Garza's crew. They had all been members of one military branch or another, and all of us had seen different struggles that had included combat for many of us. But the experience had made us grateful for each other, especially as we now seemed to be fighting a very different war. My secret designs, however, sometimes made me feel like a spy rather than a soldier. What would my new friends say if they knew what I was planning? What would they think if they knew my goals? These were things I hadn't even shared with my father, and I knew I was likely to find myself asked to leave not only Camber & Son, but likely the town, if they came to light. If I was going to go into the woods, however, I would need to be prepared. This wasn't something I could do half-cocked, and that would take knowledge and time. I had already decided that going into the deep woods alone would be a mistake. I had lived here all my life, but, as I'm sure will come as no surprise to you, the woods were not a place where parents encourage their kids to play. You could get picked up right off the street by the foresters. Going into the place they lived seemed like a great way to never come home again. Very few people who didn't work with the deep wood outfit knew much about the forest or the foresters, and it seemed that would be my first hurdle. Despite most people having never met one, there were rules in place that every child knew from a young age. I've talked about them a bit, but I don't think I really believed in them until Simon got snatched. But we all followed the rules like good kids, regardless. Most of it was that our parents believed in them, and they made sure that we knew what would happen if we didn't follow the rules. Ah yes, the rules. Don't go out after dark. If it's foggy, don't go out at all. If the fog suddenly appears, stand absolutely still until it passes. If you see a forester, don't run. Stand perfectly still until they leave. You could see them all over town, and after being gone for a while, it was a little jarring to see them again. They hung right next to posters for yard sales and band recitals, and the contrast was something you never really got used to. Walking up the sidewalk as I made my way for Susan's bookstore, I caught sight of one as it flapped merrily on the glass of the old hardware store. It must be new because someone had added the line, "Be safe this holiday season," to the bottom. Whether they meant Christmas, Thanksgiving, Halloween, or all of the above, I had no idea. It was the last week of November, and the chill was really beginning to mount. I'd spent far longer than I wanted to in a desert, and the cold was honestly something I had looked forward to. Now, with my gloves, 2 pairs of socks, and a scarf draped over my face, I kinda missed the heat. The bookstore was on Main Street, not far from Lafferty's, and it had belonged to her parents before they gave it to Susan when she finished business school. Susan always loved books, and Wormwood Books was always dripping with paperbacks, hardcovers, and various older publications. I can remember Simon and I going there from time to look at newspaper articles for school projects. Mr. and Mrs. Brayman had a collection of old town papers and documents that rivaled the public library, and a lot of history buffs went in there to peruse the shelves. The bell jangled merrily overhead as I came in, and when Susan looked up to greet me, I saw her smile nearly take in her ears. Susan and I had always been close, even closer after my brother was taken, and I think she had hoped I might return home and pick up old habits again. As much as I would have liked that, I just didn't feel that I could do that to her. Knowing how my mission was likely to end, it felt like forcing her to lose me all over again. "Jeff," she said, leaning on the counter, "I was beginning to wonder if you were ever going to come and see me." "Well, I've been pretty busy in the woods. The forest just keeps getting closer and closer without us to cut it back." She nodded. "As it's always been, I'm afraid. What brings you in today? Clearly not just to see little old me." She smiled as she said it, but there was a note of sadness behind it I couldn't miss. "I'm, curious about the Foresters," I said, pitching my voice low. There weren't a lot of people in here, but I still didn't want to raise any suspicion. You know, since I have to work so close with them. "Hopefully not too close," she said, walking out from behind the counter and leading me into the back. The sales floor was for paperbacks and first editions. The back room was for the good stuff. The Brennans had spent their life collecting rare and important things, and it made them a lot of money from people looking to research different topics. Susan likely had historians and antiquity students coming and going, paying for the privilege to root through her back rooms. I could see shelves that sagged with old books on battles from hundreds of years ago, leather-bound tomes on horticulture and herbcraft, and lists of royal bloodlines. And that was just the books that I could see and read the titles of. The section she brought me to was full of ledgers from the town founders and the beginning of our oppression with the Foresters. "It would be easier if I knew what you were looking for," she hedged, pointing to an old desk beside a dusty shelf. "I'm just doing a little reading. They're interesting, right? We've lived with them for so long, and yet we don't really understand them." Susan scoffed. "Don't we? We know they make the fog. We know they snatch people who are out after dark. We know they take kids when they can..." But she stopped talking as she realized what she was saying. "I'm sorry, Jeff. I let my mouth get away from me." "It's fine. People sometimes forget. We've all known someone who's lost someone to the Foresters." She nodded. I'll let you get to it. Remember, you have to wear the gloves if you touch the ledgers on the first or second shelf. They're in the top drawer." She left me to my devices, and I got started. Rayffered had been established in 1710. It was a logging town from the very start, but the loggers they sent into the woods came back with strange tales of creatures who took stragglers and seemed to bring demonic mists with them. Those who lit fires in the woods were never seen again, and the woods they cut back to build the town seemed to grow back at an unnatural rate. Many saw strange things at night, and residents quickly learned not to go out after dark. In 1720, one of the Rayffered magistrates claimed to have met one of the creatures, and he had given it the name Forester. One of his scribes had written his account down, since it was said that his honor was too shaken by the incident to hold a pen. He had been enjoying a pipe on the back porch of his home when a fog had suddenly rolled in, and one of the creatures had approached him. He had drawn his pistol, expecting to be taken, but wanting to go down fighting. But the creature had surprised him. Instead of taking him, it had spoken. The creature told me that it had come with a deal from the deep woods. The Foresters would continue to make the trees grow into the settlement, something they had already been doing, and the people would be free to cut them back. He told the magistrate to keep his people out of the woods that surrounded the town, though they would be free to hunt outside the deep woods during the daylight hours. No one, under any circumstances, was to light a fire inside the woods at any time, he said, and on that the creature would not budge. The logging could continue, the town could continue, and there would be no need for anyone to encroach on anyone else. For a while, this seemed to work. The town lived by the rules, and those who didn't were never seen again. People who chose to homestead in the woods disappeared. Those who went into the woods after dark disappeared. Anyone who lit a fire in the woods disappeared. The logging went on through the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, and it wasn't until the start of World War I that the treaty was broken. I was into the less crumbly ledgers by then, and found out that the mayor of 1915, Charles Magus, had decreed that the woods would again be cut. He was tired of living with superstition, and the town needed to grow. He organized contracts for several lumber companies and told them to cut as deep as they liked. When they started going missing, however, the old superstition seemed to become a little more real. 25 people went missing that first year, 10 the year after that, and 10 the year after that. If the foresters sent another emissary, it was ignored this time. The town grew, the forest continued to be cut back, and people kept going missing. That was when the rules were first established, and after that, fewer people went missing. The curfew went into place next year when the new mayor came into office. The town lived, though it lived in fear. Then came the bad night, the burning night. In 1938, the mayor decided he'd had enough of the foresters. Reginald Fox had campaigned on the grounds that he would do something about the forester problem, and boy had he. He went into the woods with a group of loggers and firemen and set the woods on fire. He claimed it was a controlled burn, something that would burn the woods away from the town, but instead of mist, it said that a black smoke buffeted the town. The foresters took 15 people in broad daylight, while the smoke covered everything, and none of the 60 men who'd gone into the woods were ever seen again. It was the largest loss to date, and the town had never set fire to the woods again. They had learned their lesson, it seemed, and it was a lesson they never forgot. Find what you're looking for? I jumped, catching the ledger as it started to fall, and looked up to find Susan smiling over me. Did I catch you doing something naughty? You didn't find any of Dad's old photo books Mom always accused him of having kept, did you? No, I said, nothing like that. Just doing a bit of research. On the foresters, she said. Not a question. Yeah, just doing some reading. Well, I hate to kick you out, but it's 5 o'clock and I need to close up before the sun goes down. Business hours are pretty bad during the winter. I looked at the little window near the ceiling, and sure enough, the sun was going down. I'd spent 5 hours back here poring over dusty tomes. Mom would be worried if I came running home right at dark again, like I'd done on Halloween, and I apologized for holding her up. No, any time. I won't pretend it isn't nice to have you hanging around. I felt a wiggly feeling in my guts, but I squashed it. I had a mission, and I couldn't lose sight of it. Would you mind if I came back next Saturday? I still want to do a little more reading. Of course. If you tell me what you're after, I can get some things out and make sure they're ready. I'll know them when I find them, but till then I'm just not sure. I put the ledgers away neatly and said my goodbyes, but when she called my name, I found myself brought up short. You know, you can tell me if you're doing something that maybe isn't wise. I won't judge you. I might even be able to help you. She looked so earnest as she locked eyes that I almost confessed my plans right there. Maybe she could help me. Maybe your dad could even help me. But I knew I couldn't bring her in on this. I wouldn't put her in any more danger than I had to. I wouldn't have another life on my conscience. I'll see you next week, I said, leaving out the front door before I could lose my resolve. I'm very lucky to be writing this. Some of us weren't so lucky, but I'll get to that. It started with a lightning storm that began after dark. Dad stopped by my room, his toothbrush still in his mouth, as he pointed to the roof of the house. He said something, but I told him to go spit before we had a conversation. He stepped out, and I heard a loud patooey from the next room before he rinsed and came back. Lightning sounds pretty close. Might be out for rain tomorrow. It was January, and the winter had been mild this year, if you could call it winter. There was very little snow, and it never really got below 30. So when New Year's had been a muggy 78, everyone had just assumed that winter had been called early. Now there was a threat of rain, and that could easily cool things off and give them another cold spell before spring. I hadn't really had to work in the blistering cold yet, and I was kind of hoping to avoid it for a while. "Hopefully not," I said, marking the spot in the book I'd been reading. Tad smirked. "Take your rest where you can get it, kid. Soon it'll be summer, and you'll be praying for a good rain day." I went to bed not long after, but the rain never came. The lightning persisted throughout the night, but when I woke up in the morning to the rumble of the not-so-distant thunder, I supposed that Dad wouldn't get his rain day after all. He seemed a little grumpy as he came down for breakfast, the lightning still arcing across the sky, and as we got into the car and headed for the yard, he was getting downright ornery. "Look at this," he said, indicating the sky. "It's black as pitch and still no rain. Those clouds are fit to burst, and you just know they're waiting for us to get into the woods before they open up. It's going to make for a miserable, wet day out in the forest." Turned out, Pops was wrong on that one, though it might have been easier if he wasn't. We got to the yard at the usual time, daylight fighting for supremacy, and Garza told us at the morning rundown that we would only be working until the rain started. The supervisors believed it would be about noon, but it was hard to tell in this part of the world. The weather was temperamental at the best of times here, and the rain was just as likely to hit when we were getting ready to go as it was when we were packing in for the day. Regardless, we grabbed our gear and headed for the woods. We were in a little subdivision today on the west side of town, a place I remembered from when I was a kid. One of my best friends had lived over here, and the city was trying to reclaim it so they could use the property again. If there were people trying to keep the forest cut back, it tended to stay occupied longer. This particular subdivision, however, had been mostly empty for about 8 years, and the friend in question had left for college before his parents could move to Bennett. Bennett was a place where you could go out after dark and not worry about foresters. The neighborhood was much the same way it had been the last time I'd been here. The sidewalk had a few more cracks, the road had a little more grass on it, but the houses had gotten the worst of it. The backyards were full of new-growth trees, and many of the houses had greenery coming out of them. The windows had likely been crashed out by town kids looking for some fun, but a few of them were the victims of trees that had grown too close to the houses, or, in a few cases, trees growing out of the foundation. The thunder was a constant background reminder of the rain. A few of the guys looked a little hesitant about cutting with it so close. We were essentially holding big iron lightning rods, and it'd be way too easy for the arc to come down and fry whoever was holding it. Garza told us it was far enough away to make that unlikely, and we believed him. After all, we didn't think he would put us in any more danger than was strictly necessary, and I still believe that. Garza liked to make sure his people came home safely. It happened at about 11. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, and the lightning came down again and again as we prepared to pack up early. We were working near an old derelict two-story, something that had probably been a nice house once, when Ramsey yelled for us to get ready if the drop started coming down. The atmosphere was an excited one, guys preparing for a day away from the woods, and Derek was just asking if I wanted to go get some lunch at Franny's when I was suddenly enveloped in the sound and fury of an angry flash grenade. I was blinded, my vision coming back slowly as I fell back on the lawn. I blinked furiously, my ears ringing like a tinnitus nightmare, and as voices erupted around me, I shook my head and realized I still couldn't hear anything. The ringing had become low-grade, almost background, but as they drug me away from the house we had been working near, I realized my vision had come back as I blinked rapidly. Some people were running towards it, and I blinked as something flared up inside the house. Fire. The house was on fire. Wood! Wood! Someone was shouting, and I realized I could hear them, though it was like hearing the voice at the end of the tin can telephone. I shook my head, trying to get my bearings, and I felt a strong hand hold me down as I tried to get up. "Take it easy, son. You were right there next to the strike when it hit, and it probably scrambled you a little bit." As my mind stopped flashing like a switchboard, I remembered that his name was Ramsey, and that was when I remembered that I hadn't been working alone. "Derek, where's Derek? Did someone get him out?" "Easy, easy," Ramsey said, holding my head as he looked me over. "I don't think you're concussed. I think you just got your battery scrambled a little. We're looking for Derek right now, but we got to get this fire out before it spreads." I could see the rest of the crew trying to fight the spreading fire, but right then I was more worried about Derek. If he was near the fire, then he might be in danger. I got up shakily, Ramsey telling me to be careful, but I had to help. The whole thing reminded me of the war, or helping those under fire, and I was off and running before Ramsey could catch me. I coughed as I hit the edge of the smoke, but the smoke wasn't the only thing obscuring my vision. There was a fog beginning to roll in, a heavy bank that was threatening to obscure my efforts, and I was blundering in without thought. If the foresters got me, then they got me, but I would make sure that Derek was okay first. I could see the fence we had been near, a tree leaning half across it as it made a break for the woods. That's where I saw the chainsaw that Derek had left behind. It was still sticking out of the tree, halfway through the trunk. I coughed, looking around for any sign of my friend, and that's when I noticed the drag marks. The ones going towards the woods. Someone had dragged themselves through a hole in the fence and deeper into the forest. Or, I thought, they had been dragged. I headed into the woods after him, not caring which it was. If I could catch up to him, maybe I could help him, save him, and that way I hadn't been able to save Simon. I had to try, and as the branches slapped at me, I kept following the drag marks into the muddy outskirts. The lightning flashed overhead, still sounding close enough to make me nervous, and as the first drop came down, I felt my foot hit something solid, and I fell hard against the bottom of a thick bush. Derek was still trying to pull himself, mumbling as he looked around in a daze. "Derek!" I breathed, trying to keep my voice low as I took a knee beside him. "Are you okay?" "Shooting! They're shooting at us, Buck! Shooting! They're shooting! They're shooting! They're..." He kept on repeating it as he pulled himself away from the fire, clearly not sure where he was going. He'd been closer to the house than I was, so it's possible he had gotten it worse. I tried to tell him that we had to get moving, but that's when I started hearing the crunch of footsteps. They crunched heedlessly through the underbrush, and I could make a guess who was coming with the fog. "Shooting! They're shooting at us! Shooting! Shooting! Shoot!" I covered his mouth as I held him still. He bucked around a little as the footsteps got closer, but I held him as still as I could manage as he tried to get away. I wanted to smack him, but I leaned down as something crashed about 20 feet behind us and tried to break through to him before he got us caught. "Shut up, Derek, and be still. If the foresters catch us, I'll never let you hear the end of it." Even in his current state, that seemed to get through to him. As the rain came down, we sat amongst the leaves and sticks as the foresters made their way towards the fire. The raindrops were thick and cold as they soaked into our clothes, and Derek stilled as we waited for the coast to clear. The mud sucked at my boots as I tried to stay absolutely still, and as my teeth chattered and my arms shook, I heard something squelch not even 5 feet away. I felt Derek shudder as I held him, and I put my head down. I could guess what he was looking at. I could see the wooden legs, the roots running up to the knee, and silently prayed that it would move on. It stood like a statue, however, likely trying to make sense of us as it hovered there, and I tried to stop from shaking as the cold threatened to sink into my bones. It was probably less than a minute, but it felt like the forester stood there for hours. When it finally took a step and made its way towards the likely extinguished fire, we all sighed in relief. Even so, we stayed there until we heard people calling our names. If they were calling for us, then the foresters must have moved on, and we got up and made our way carefully back to the job site. The house, already a ruin when we'd arrived, was now a pile of ash and bricks. It had burnt to the basement, the rain stopping it from getting much farther. All four of them looked sooty and wet, but they were relieved to see us. Garza sighed as we came walking out of the woods, patting our shoulders as if to make sure we were real. I was not looking forward to explaining to your father how you'd nearly been struck by lightning and then run off into the woods. I appreciate your bravery, son, but don't do that again. I was pretty glad I had my nitroglycerin in the truck. We all piled in, the rain pummeling the camper shell as we drove, and the others filled us in on what had happened. The lightning had struck the house and set it on fire, and after getting me out of there, they started trying to put it out. They knew the foresters would be mad if they saw the smoke, and they started trying to get the fire out as quickly as possible. The house had a well, and the well still had power, and as the flames grew, they had noticed the fog rolling in. After I'd run off, Garza had told them to get back to the truck, and as the rain started coming down, they had all breathed a sigh of relief. The foresters had come to inspect the fire, but as the house collapsed and the rain put out the rest, they'd gone back to the woods, taking the fog with them. They'd been coming to look for us, or what might be left of us, when we had come staggering out of the woods. Dad had made a fitful sound when I told him what had happened, and he asked me not to tell my mom about it. No need worrying her. You did the right thing, kiddo, but we should be a little more careful. You could have ended up joining Derek in the deep woods. I sat down to write this after getting a hot shower and getting out of my wet clothes, and it's an experience I don't think I'll ever forget. The rain is really coming down out there, hitting the roof like hailstones, and it gives me a shiver. Derek sent me a text a half hour ago. They took him to the hospital after Ramsey had a look at him, and he's definitely concussed. The ER docs are giving him a week's worth of bed rest, but he says it could have been a lot worse if I hadn't come to get him. He claims he owes me his life. I told him to get better so I don't have to pick up too much of his slack. Derek's a good friend. I'm pretty glad the foresters didn't get him. I'm not sure what we would have done if the rain hadn't started. The house was too big for us to have fought the fire with buckets, and I shudder to think what the foresters would have done if they'd arrived to find us throwing water on it. We would probably have all died, or worse, and I hope the lightning will be over by tomorrow. Though, it does give me an idea for my inevitable incursion into the deep woods. Hey, I need to close up, so unless you're staying the night, I'm gonna have to run you off. I looked up from one of the dustier old tomes, another history of the early days of Rayffered, and smiled at Susan. She was standing in the doorway, the sun getting low behind the glass in the windows, and the jingling of her keys meant it was time for her to lock up for another day. I put down the book I'd been reading and set the heavy rubber gloves she'd given me on the desk aside. I hadn't learned much, but the trips were still important. I had yet to find out much about the mysterious foresters, other than how to avoid them, but I had discovered a few things that might help me fight them, if it came to that. After the lightning storm, one of my theories had been put to rest, though. The fire was not something that the foresters feared. A couple of days after the fire, we were working in the same spot. We were working near the shell of the house when I noticed that the fire hadn't burnt it to the ground. I had assumed it had been put out by the crew before the foresters got there, but Ramsey told me that the forest walkers had put it out themselves. We hid in the trees when we heard them coming, and they just kind of waded in and beat the fire out. It was something to see, I tell you. Wait, they didn't burn? Ramsey shook his head. Nope, which is weird since some of them have wood parts. They went right in and had it all put out before the rain even started. That made me think. The foresters had to have a weakness of some sort, but if it wasn't fire, then what could it be? Something told me that it had something to do with the deep woods, so I'd been reading anything that Susan's store had about the woods. A lot of people, the loggers especially, had gone into the outskirts of the forest, but very few had gone to the deep woods and come back to talk about it. 2 of them had been sent to the mental hospital after they came out raving. This was about the turn of the century, but one of them still lived in town. Jameson Worthy had celebrated his 70th birthday this year and hadn't said a word for 55 of those 70 years. He had been a logger in the years between the war, and when his outfit had been set upon by the foresters just as dark set, the town had thought they were all lost. They found Jameson the next day, wandering beside the road and mumbling about having seen the deep woods. They took him to the local doctor, a fellow named Burke, and when the boy had been brought in, Burke said he had stopped babbling and gone silent. The men who'd found him had gotten very little out of him about the deep woods, and Jameson hadn't said another word about it for the rest of his life. Whatever secrets he had seen in the deep woods would likely stay there. "You okay?" Susan asked, drawing me out of my thoughts as she locked up the shop. "Yeah, just thinking." "About?" she asked, the 2 of us walking down the sidewalk as we left Main Street. "I guess I'm just wondering why no one has ever made a list of people that have gone missing. It would have to be quite a few by this point. I wonder if it would help us understand why the foresters take people." She sighed theatrically. "I swear, Jeff, you're the only person I know that's interested in foresters." She said it with a little giggle. "Well, the second, I guess, if we're being honest." I looked at her questioningly. "The second?" "Well, yeah. Who do you think helped Dad collect all those books? My Uncle Terry is a historian, especially when it comes to town history. He's been studying the foresters for years. I'm surprised you don't remember him." I could have kicked myself for not thinking of it sooner. Susan's uncle was one of the foremost authorities on town history, and he sat on the council for the Heritage Museum, as well as being the acting liaison for the city council in matters that held interest to the museum. His research into the foresters was something I had not known about, and was likely something he didn't talk about often. The foresters were considered a sore subject with the mayor and the sheriff, and people who might be thinking about poking their noses into it were discouraged severely. I'll admit, the last time I was at your house regularly, I wasn't exactly interested in studying history. Susan smiled. I seem to remember it was anatomy you were interested in. I blushed a little. Yeah, you may be right about that. She grinned. He's staying at the house if you'd like to see him. He always liked you, so I don't think he would mind talking to you. Why is your uncle staying with your parents? I blurted out before I could think better of it. Well, when Aunt Helen died last year of cancer, Uncle Terry fell into a depression. Dad offered to let him stay with us, and, well, you know how Uncle Terry is about his books. Our basement is like a library, and he practically lives down there these days. He does come up for meals, dinner chief among them, if you'd like to stay for dinner. I thought about it, weighing the knowledge gained against the earful I'd get from my mom about being out after dark. I decided it was worth the risk and told her I'd be glad to have dinner with her family. She smiled, and I'd be lying if it was all about seeing our uncle. As much as I tried to play the stoic, I had missed Susan, and the more time I spent at the bookstore, the harder it was not to slip back into old habits. Susan was a lovely girl, someone I would have liked to settle down with, but I had to keep reminding myself that I might not be here much longer to be settled down. She deserves something stable, something that I wouldn't be able to give her. But when she took my hand as we walked to her house, I still felt my heart flutter a little. I'd felt that same flutter when I was 12, and it wasn't a feeling you forgot. Susan's house was the same as it had always been, a 2-story wooden farmhouse with a big backyard and grass that her father seemed to constantly keep a lush and healthy green. The 2 bikes laying on it would surely set him into fits, and her twin brothers came out to grab them when they saw me and ran over. Timothy and Gabe were 13, and they had certainly grown since the last time I'd seen them. The gawky pair of 8-year-olds that I had last seen had grown about a foot, and they would soon be taller than I was. "Jeff!" they both yelled, burying me in a hug as the 2 jostled to see who could get the most of themselves around me. "Are you staying for dinner? Do you want to play tonight? We got Xbox and Call of Duty. You can be the first player if you—" "Easy, boys," Susan said, half laughing as she tried to pry them off. "Jeff's just staying for dinner. He wants to talk to Uncle Terry for a minute, but then he says he has to go home." The boys seemed disappointed, but I just shrugged. My mom will get worried if I stay out too late. They nodded, that making a lot of sense, and they followed us to the porch as they chattered about school and games and sports and 1,000 other things. When they broke off to go put their bikes away, Susan bumped me with her hip and smirked. "You know you'll have to come play now. It'll break their heart otherwise." I nodded. Should I have my mom call your mom and find out when it's best? As if on cue, her mother opened the door and half bellowed for the twins to put their bikes away when she saw Susan and I standing on the porch. Susan's mom had never been what you would call a fan of mine. Susan and I had been close for a long time, and I think she was secretly afraid that I was going to knock her daughter up in high school. Susan had wanted to go to school and have a future, and she was rightfully worried that I was going to take that from her. She wasn't wrong. I would have liked very much to have slept with her daughter in high school, and seeing me now with her daughter's hand in mine was like Scrooge seeing the ghost of Christmas past all over again. "Jeffrey! What a surprise! Susan, you should have told me you had a guest for dinner." "Well, I didn't. It's my fault, ma'am. I kind of invited myself. I'm sorry if it's an inconvenience." She pursed her lips in that familiar way that she'd always done, and that was all the outward sign I needed to know that I had indeed inconvenienced her. "Not at all. It's an honor to have a war hero at our table." The words practically dripped with sarcasm, but she let me in all the same. Susan's house was a perfect mixture of cozy 80s aesthetic with modern touches. The modern TV in the living room looked out of place beside the overstuffed couches and the walnut paneling they'd had since I was young. The computer in the den was at odds with her roll-top desk and the deep pile carpet. It would have felt disorienting to a younger person, but to me, it was just a comfortable bit of nostalgia. I'd spent a lot of time in this house, and I was nearly as familiar with it as I was my own. After Simon, Susan had become one of my best friends, and I'd gone to her house more than once to simply not be alone. So when she pointed at the basement and told me her uncle was down there, I hardly needed the directions. "I'll distract Mom so you and Unc can have a good talk," she whispered, walking into the kitchen as her mother plated the food for dinner. The basement was one of my favorite rooms in the house, purely for the smell. As the door came open, I was hit by the smell of old paper and the musty aroma of ages. The basement was a single large room with shelves built into the walls. Susan's grandfather had built it when the house was built, and her father had extended it after the house became his. The shelves were a floor-to-ceiling construction, the old wood practically sagging under the weight of all those books. Some were shiny in protective bags, and some were dropping flakes on the ground as they slowly disintegrated. But to me, the room had always been so cool. There was a big round table in the middle. Susan's father had always called it a King Arthur table, and it was covered in books and papers. The wastepaper basket beside it was overflowing with crumpled sheets and spent pens, and hunched up over the table was someone else who had changed drastically in 4 years. Susan's uncle, Terry, had been the youngest of her uncles, barely into his 30s when I'd left for enlistment. He looked like a man pushing 50 now as he sat raggedly over the table, his once neat blonde hair wild and scooped back into a tail. He looked thinner than I remembered him, though he had never been a big guy. The loss of his wife had shrunk him, and I felt bad for him as I came to the foot of the stairs. "I'll be up in a minute, Claire. But when he turned, he blinked as if not understanding what he was seeing. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know we had company. I'm Terry. And you are?" He put out a hand, and I shook it. "It's Jeff. We've actually met before." He thought about it and laughed when it finally came to him. "Jeff, yeah, back from the war. How have you been, son? You seem to have come back in one piece." He offered me a chair, and I took it as I looked at the books he had spread across the desk. All of them were books about the city's history, except for a noticeable entry about chemistry. "What brings you down here to my little hole in the ground?" I started to laugh, thinking he was making a joke, but the cot in the corner kind of proved his statement. "I'm doing some research on town history, and I figured you'd be the best one to help me." He smirked. "Clearly not for a school paper. Are you doing any particular research?" I looked at the stairs, not really wanting anyone to know what I was after. "I'm researching the foresters." He nodded slowly, and I got the feeling he had been expecting me to say something like that. "And why would you be doing that?" I tried to think of a good reason, but the longer I hesitated, the more he seemed to understand. "I get the feeling this is less for scholarly pursuits and more for practical purposes. Am I close?" My lips came together in a hard line as I thought about it, finally nodding as I decided to trust him. I won't ask you to help, but as if you would have to," Terry said, chuckling a little as he sat back. "I've been waiting for someone with the sand to take it to the foresters for a while, and that's what you intend to do." "I do," I whispered, not wanting to put that out in the world just yet. "Then you've come to the right place. I've got a wealth of information here, information I don't dare put out in my niece's shop for fear of the wrong people finding it. I've been considering fighting for years, ever since they took a friend of mine when I was in middle school, but up until now, I lacked help." "Surely other people in town would help you," I said, not believing for a minute that I was the first one to come looking. "Most people in town have lost someone to the foresters." "They're scared, son. They don't want to rock the boat. The city council, especially the mayor, doesn't want to rock the boat. They want things to stay the way they are, and they're willing to make little sacrifices to keep it that way." "Like my brother," I said, "and your friend." "Exactly." Someone upstairs called for dinner, and Terry got up, his legs sounding like chestnuts as they popped. "How long do you have tonight?" he asked. "I don't have to be back in the woods till Monday, so I suppose I could stay here tonight if I needed to." He nodded. "We'll discuss it after dinner. If you decide you need to go home, I'll drive you. Foresters don't usually bother people in vehicles, not since the 20s at least." As I followed him upstairs, I realized I'd found an ally in all this, maybe even a teacher who could help me make plans. If Terry had been studying for all this time, then he really could be the one I'd been looking for. And as we sat down to eat, Susan's father grinned hugely as he saw me. Her dad and I had always gotten along. I knew it would be the first meal of many that I ate here. I ended up staying that night, but I doubt my father would have been so leading with his questions if he knew where I'd spent it. Susan came down to the basement to see about us, but she eventually went to bed when it was clear that we were doing our own thing. Her uncle and I pored over my notes late into the night. He praised my research work and helped me fill in a few holes that I had in my theory. He hadn't known about the fire, something that surprised him, But he did tell me something that made me think it might not be all about the foresters. The city-run farmers that sit on the outskirts use a particular chemical to combat the wood beetles that live in the area. The compound, like the beetles, appears nowhere else in nature, and I can only assume that they're connected. Meaning, I asked? Meaning that the only place I can imagine they would get this compound is from the deep woods, and I think they're getting it from the foresters. After that night in the basement, I had 2 jobs to occupy my time. My weekdays were spent in the woods, cutting back the wild that threatened to overtake us. On the weekends, however, I worked with Terry, trying to figure out about the enemy that I meant to fight. Sometimes Susan came down to sit with us or bring us snacks, but mostly it was just the 2 of us in the dusty old basement. Terry, I discovered, had been doing research for years, but couldn't seem to get very deep below the surface. He had scoured the archives, the tunnels below the library, but it hadn't gotten him much. It held some old accounts of early days, some history and first-hand accounts, but a lot of the documents that should be present seemed to be gone. He didn't know where they'd gone to, but he had found some of them in his brother's private collection, and that made him even more suspicious. I have no doubt that they're in someone's private library. All Franklin has are copies, but the question is whose. After that, Terry had started doing some digging and hit bones. The beetles, it seems, had been a big problem until the late 20s. Suddenly, pesticides had been developed to fight them, and the beetles had stopped eating up all the crops. 5 years after that, some people had started developing lung problems, and that was when the first of the cancer had been discovered in the citizens of Rayffered, with a close proximity to the crops and the farm trade. Terry had figured out that the beetles, the pesticide, and the foresters were linked, but he'd hit a wall. It had been suggested that digging too deep might be hazardous to his health, and he had taken his research underground. I was the first person he had trusted enough to speak about it since ever, but that hadn't stopped people from remaining suspicious of him. I don't understand how you can't just request books from whoever they are. You're the head of the Historical Society. You sit on the city council, for God's sake. I sit on the city council, Terry said, but it's an honorific. I'm really just there to make sure the historical integrity of the town is upheld. All the power lies with the mayor and the sheriff. I nodded. That tracked and made a lot of sense. Those are 2 figures I haven't talked about much. The town of Rayffered isn't huge, as I've said, but it's a town that believes a lot in the power of old money. Mayor Charles Register was part of that old money. He's been the mayor since I was a kid, and he has to be in his 2nd decade of the job. He's a local, a high school football quarterback in his day, worked the woods with Corbin logging in between games, went to college for a little while, then came back with a law degree so he could get started getting ready to run the town. Everyone knows him, and more importantly, they know his family. The Registers are an old bunch of logger barons that have been a part of the town and its politics since the founding. 4 previous Registers have been mayors, though not as long as Charles, and they're often mentioned in the dedication pages and the thank you speeches of those in power, where Rayffered is concerned at least. Then there's Sheriff McKenzie. McKenzie was another local staple, but for less philanthropic reasons. McKenzie had been a cop right out of high school a decade ago now, and in that decade, he'd been at the center of a number of scandals. Bad busts, bad force, missing witnesses, allegations of planted evidence, and threatened statements. The list went on and on. He was always quick to play the good old boy when the spotlight was on him, but the things he did in the shadows were what gave him his reputation. He was supposed to have more than a few lackeys in the department that did what he said, when he said it, and didn't ask a lot of questions. Even for a soldier like me, that kind of thing was damn scary. If Terry was on the radar of those two, then he had every right to be worried. After discovering holes in the archives and being told to leave it alone, he told me that he'd been asking questions for town history he'd supposedly been writing for years. Nothing too intrusive, I've assured them, but it's hard to talk about the town without the foresters. I'm also, as far as they know, writing a memorial book for those we've lost. That's the pretense I'm using, but in reality, it's just an effort to find something to use against the bastards. The books were there for those who might want to see them, but Terry knew that he would never actually publish them. He'd ask the wrong questions to the wrong person one of these days and end up in the woods, permanently. Whether it was as a forester or as a corpse, it hardly mattered. Either way, he would ask his questions no more. Either way, he had to keep seeming to work on it. And that's how, one Sunday around lunchtime, we came to be sitting in the living room of Ruth Darnry. Ruth had been born in Rayffered in 1944, the youngest of a brood of 8. Her father had been one of those names on the town monument, one of the few to go to war and come back, and she was the last of the Darnrys in Rayffered. She was 65, a member of the Ladies' Auxiliary, and she had been part of something that had brought us here to talk to her today. Ruth had been a part of the hide-and-seek abduction of 62. "When we get here," Terry had said as he straightened his tie, "let me do the talking. Ruth is pretty open about the incident, but she's become more than a little careful about who she talks to." We were dressed in what Mom had called Sunday best, and I wondered what all the fuss was about to talk to an old lady who probably wouldn't remember that we were here tomorrow. I was wrong on that account. Despite pushing 70, Ruth was sharp and amazingly still in possession of her faculties. She had no family to live with her, no cousins or relations to help her along, and her house was well kept and free of clutter. There was none of the usual smells involved in an elderly person's house either. No faint smell of pee or perfume to hide an unwashed body. Ruth was still very independent and refused our offers to help her in the kitchen as we sat in the den. "This is for some kind of book, you said?" she asked, setting down glasses of tea as she took her seat. We were in the house that her parents had built when she was 2, and it was a little sad to think that it would never see another Darnry after her. Terry told me that Ruth had refused to marry, refused to have children, and had always been outspoken about not bringing children up here. "This isn't a place for children," she would say, but not where anyone but friends could hear her. "Yes, ma'am," Terry assured her. "It's a memorial of sorts for those who have been lost to the forest. Would you mind telling us about the incident?" She sat down and chuckled to herself as she took a sip of tea. "I suppose if I did mind, I wouldn't have told you could come here, would I?" "I suppose not," Terry said with a little chuckle. "It was the summer of 62, wasn't it?" Ruth nodded. "It was midway through summer break, one of the last weeks in July, when I saw them for the last time." She swirled the tea in her glass, looking off into the distance. I became quite certain that she was time traveling, and when Terry nudged me and indicated I should turn on the recorder, I nodded and hit the button. I was playing the part of his assistant, and he was certainly leaning into the role of my mentor. "It was mid-afternoon, sunset, still just an idea on the horizon, when we decided to play hide-and-seek. My cousins were over, our group now 12 in number, and my oldest brother Cliff had decided to count. We all knew not to go beyond the blue mailbox at the end of the cul-de-sac, but everything else was fair game. We all scattered like quail looking for the best spot to place ourselves, and Clint could have probably followed his ears to most of the younger kids. He had gotten to 60 when I saw the bush beside Mrs. Yap's porch. I knew I had the perfect place to avoid getting found, and as I climbed into the middle of it, where there was a little seat of wooden branches just right for someone my size, I didn't notice the fog until after Cliff had stopped counting, and when he started shouting for us to come in, we all thought it was a trick. His shouting became more frantic, his cries taking on a higher tone, and I think I knew something was different then. Clint wasn't the kind of person who got scared easily, and if he was screaming for us to hurry, something bad had happened. When my Uncle Mitch came out to tell us to come in, his voice was high and unlike anything I had ever heard from him. Uncle Mitch was a logger, and not much made him sound like that. I saw some of the younger kids break cover then and head for the house. Uncle Mitch had come out to help Clint look for us before the Forresters got there, but I stayed put. I remembered the rules and knew that running was the last thing you wanted to do. "The rules?" I asked, my disbelief breaking my character. I didn't know the rules had been there that long. Ruth smiled wetly, her teeth mostly gone. "Oh, yes, even in those days the town had rules. If you were stuck in the fog, you sat down and stayed put. You didn't run, you didn't yell, and you stayed as still as a statue until it passed. That was the way of it, but I was the only one that remembered it that day. I peeked out from under the branches of my hiding spot and saw the fog bank moving across the street. It was getting thicker, covering my little bush as I sat and waited for it to stop. Outside, I heard people beginning to scream, my uncle loudest amongst them. Their childish screams were cut out one at a time, and I was left in a silence deeper than the fog around me. The fog remained for what felt like forever, and when it finally went away, the sun was just a thin line on the horizon. When I came home, my daddy threw his arms around me and said that God had seen fit to bring one child back that day. I cried with him, but I knew it wasn't God that had taken my brothers and sisters, or my cousin and my uncle. It was the Forresters, and if I gave them the chance, they would take me and any children I brought into this world. It's an odd thing to know at 8 years old that you'll never have a child of your own, but it was a promise I've kept after that day. A bitter seed had been planted in me, and the Forresters have only themselves to blame for the demise of my family. Rayffered is not the place for children. It's blighted land, and where nothing but cattle grazing on it till it's time for the slaughter." Terry sat in silence through the whole thing, just letting her get it all out. The ice in her tea glass rattled a little as her hands shook, and I knew that she was reliving that day as she sat hunkered in the bush, listening to her family disappear. It had probably happened not far from the house, probably happened right across the street, and I couldn't imagine what it was like to live right down the road from the most tragic event of your life. "Thank you, Mrs. Darnley. The names of your kin will be added to the book. They will be remembered. Never doubt it." She nodded slowly. "Clint, Marjorie, Garrett, Maisie, Selena, Carter, Heath were my siblings. They'd all likely be dead now, And I think now that I've just been holding on so I could tell you this story. Gabby, Claire, Rutherford, Ferdy, and my Uncle Mitch, too. 12 lost in a single day. One of the biggest losses in town history. Really makes you think. We thanked her, packing up our recorders and notepads and taking our leave. Standing on the porch, it was easy to forget that in just 8 hours, the foresters would come back out again, if they didn't come with the fog before then. I found myself looking for the bush from her story, but I realized it was unlikely to still be there. That's how most of the stories go, Terry said. 9 times out of 10, it's tykes in the yard or kids on their way home from school. People just coming from somewhere who discover a fog bank. Lost souls who will never be seen again. Like Simon, I said quietly, and Terry nodded. We were quiet as we came back to Susan's house, but he broke it as we stood on the porch and looked at each other gravely. I need a favor, an important one. I waited expectantly, guessing what he wanted, but not quite sure I could do it. Neither your dad or your boss will talk to me about the fire of 91. I need that information. I need to know exactly what happened. They are 2 of the few to survive that fire, a fire that close to the source, and come home, and their testimony would be worth more than all the rest. I need a first-hand account from one of them, and I need it soonish. Why soonish? I asked, unsure what he was after. Things are in play that I don't think you're aware of. Certain timers have begun to run faster, and if they're allowed to do so, it could mean the end of Rayffered as we know it. If we don't figure this out pretty quick, we may not have a home here for much longer. He left me on the porch to contemplate that, and it was heavy indeed. I was walking home from Susan's house, thinking about what Terry had told me, when the squad car pulled up next to me. I breathed a sigh of relief when I saw the nose of the cruiser, but only until I remembered what Terry had told me about the sheriff. I had thought someone had been following me for a while, and I had been worried that it would turn out to be a creep or something. The sight of the cop car should have filled me with relief, but it made me more than a little nervous as the eyes of the driver turned to me. I thought maybe they were just checking on a call or something, but when the driver rolled the window down, I saw that it wasn't just any patrolman. The sheriff hadn't changed much in the time I'd been gone, though it appeared he had lost a little more hair and added a few more wrinkles. He had congratulated me on my heroism when I came back, shaking my hand as I stood between he and the mayor, receiving my placard. That being said, I think even as a kid I had recognized that his good-natured smiles never went all the way to his eyes. He was calculating, and you could see it working on him, even as he grinned at me through the window of his car. "Where you heading?" "Just heading home, Sheriff," I answered, trying not to sound guilty and mostly just sounding unsure of myself. "Why don't I give you a ride?" he offered, reaching over to open the passenger side door. The offer was tempting, but I honestly didn't want to be stuck in a car with Sheriff McKenzie. Not if I could help it. "That's okay," I said, as I tried to keep the apprehension out of my voice. "It's not far, and I like to stay in shape." As I took another couple of steps, he pulled the car up alongside me, the smile deteriorating ever so slightly. "You're right. It's not that far, and I just want to see how you're settling into civilian life. Come on, let an old one-horse town sheriff live vicariously through a great war hero for a minute." I remembered what I'd been thinking earlier, about how the sheriff might be dangerous, and decided that it might be for the best to just accept the ride. He wasn't going to kill me on the street. He had no reason to. Wasn't doing anything wrong. Hadn't been doing anything wrong. and the idea that he might hurt me was stupid. I was a local celebrity, someone who could handle myself if he decided to get violent, and we both knew it. Even so, it was hard to forget what Terry had told me about the sheriff and the mayor, that they seemed to have all the power these days. The only other thing in town that seemed to have power were the foresters, and I was way less afraid of some small-town lawman than the creatures that snatched the town's children. I climbed into the cruiser and tried to look comfortable as we drove towards my house. "So how you adjusting? Picking up where you left off?" "I suppose so," I told him. This was a strange line of questioning, especially considering we had never interacted before I got back from Iraq. I'd seen him at assembly sometimes when I was in high school, or coming to talk to the principal about some hell-raising that had gone on the night before, but I think this was probably the first conversation I'd ever had with Jerry Mackenzie. "We haven't seen you at the local events lately. We were worried that maybe you were having some trouble coming back to civilian life. It's not good for the town morale when a local legend is having trouble fitting in." "I've just been busy," I told him, almost absent-mindedly. "Working for Camber and Son, being in the woods 5 days a week, trying to get back to life. I barely started before I left." Mackenzie smiled knowingly. "I say we were worried, right up until we noticed you were hanging around the bookstore owned by your old flame. She's a good-looking girl. You should feel very lucky." That got my neck hair up a little bit. Had they been watching me? Why had they been watching me? I was, as far as any of them knew, a hometown hero. What reason did I have to be under surveillance by the sheriff of Rayffered? It all smacked of something a little sinister, and I didn't like it. "Seems like you've been getting cozy with the Brenham family," he said, almost too low for me to hear. "Sorry?" I said, turning to give him my full attention as he spun the wheel lazily. "We see you running errands with our Uncle Terry. That is company you might want to be careful around." I opened my mouth to say more, but he drove past the road that would have taken him to my house, and I watched it disappear with a sense of dread. "Hey, you missed my turnoff, Sheriff." "Did I?" he asked lazily, flashing me a smile. "Oh, well, there's someone else that wants to have a word with you anyway. A very important person has asked me to facilitate a meeting between the two of you, and he's not the kind of man you say no to when he wants something." I wanted to argue, but there wasn't really much I could say. I tried the door and found that it was locked. I didn't want to cause a scene by trying to jump out of his car in the middle of traffic, not being sure I could unlock the door in his cruiser anyway. I went along for the ride, figuring I'd learn soon enough who wanted my attention. Mackenzie took a few roads seemingly at random, and as we pulled into the nicer part of town, I was unsurprised when we came to rest outside the mayor's house. Mayor Register had one of the largest houses amongst the 5 or 6 in that subdivision. It wasn't a mansion, not really, but it likely had about twice as many rooms and 3 times as much square footage as my parents' house hosted. I was sure there was a swimming pool in the backyard, an amenity that very few had around here, since the forest seemed to send its roots searching everywhere. As I climbed out of the cruiser, I thought about running. It wasn't like he was going to shoot me in the street, but then I remembered what Terry had said about people the mayor thought were interfering with the forest and its denizens. The foresters aren't the only ones who make people disappear in this town. "Come on," Sheriff Mackenzie said, as if guessing what I was thinking. "The mayor just wants a quick word. I promise we'll have you home before sundown." As little as I wanted to, I went with him into the mayor's palatial home. We came in through a foyer that looked bigger than my barracks at Basic and walked through a sitting room that led to a kitchen that led out to the backyard. The kitchen had amenities in it that I'd never seen before, and the whole thing looked like the galley on a spaceship. There was indeed a pool in the backyard, and sitting at one of the little tables poolside was Mayor Register. He was wearing part of his usual steel blue suit, The coat hung across the back of the chair he now occupied, and his white shirt seemed to cover his small frame like a funeral shroud. He had shrunk some in the time I had been gone, his age finally catching up with him, and he didn't look well. His skin kind of hung on him, the color looking off, and I suspected that he might be wearing a toupee. He looked up as we came to the side of the pool, waving us over as he took a drink of something from a large glass. I thought it might have been beer, but as I got closer, I noticed that it was thick and not altogether healthy looking. "Want one?" the mayor asked, seeing me looking at the glass. "It's a health shake from somewhere overseas. Tastes terrible, but it's as good as a meal, and it's supposed to stave off cancer and all sorts of things. Haven't got it yet, so maybe it works." I told him I would pass and took a seat in the chair across from him. Sheriff Mackenzie loomed on my left shoulder, and I got the suspicion that he was preparing to intercede if needed. What was he afraid I was going to do exactly? Did he think I was going to kill the mayor for inviting me over for a drink? The whole thing seemed even stranger the longer it went on, and I almost felt like I should have a hat in my hand as I met with this Mayor Don. "We were just curious to see how you were getting along," the mayor said as he took another sip from his glass and grimaced. "When I came back from college, it was so difficult to return to the normal humdrum life of Rayffered. Once you've been out of town, it all just seems so small, and you've been farther than most. I would have preferred to meet with you in my office, but it appears you're a hard man to track down these days." He looked at me over the rim of his glass, trying for a playful disapproval, but coming off as somewhat daffy. "I mean," I said, feeling like I needed to make explanations for my busy schedule, "I've been in the woods most days, working for Camber & Son. Otherwise, I'm just enjoying my downtime, trying to get back into civilian life." "And the civilians you left behind," Sheriff Mackenzie said dryly. "Don't be crass, Jerry," Mayor Register said. "We had noticed you spending a lot of time with old friends, maybe making some new ones." He took another long sip from the glass, and when he looked up, all the goodwill was gone. "What can you tell me about Terry Bremen and his latest writing project?" he asked, his tone sounding less playful than it had before. "You would know better than I would. He sits on the council with you and the sheriff, doesn't he?" The mayor steepled his fingers before his eyes, a distinctly wizardly-looking gesture. "If I can be honest with you, Terry hasn't been himself for the last couple of years. Since his wife died, he's been very distant, and he's been talking to people that I would rather he not talk to. He's been working on books for the last 3 years. Do you know that? One of them he started before his wife died, but the other one is a ledger about those who have been lost to the foresters. I've asked him several times why he feels he needs to write such a book, and every time he tells me the same thing. It's to honor the dead, and the dead should be honored for their sacrifice. Maybe you agree with him. I know you lost a brother to the foresters, but if a book like that ever got out, people might start looking at Rayffered in a different light. No one believes the crackpots that try to tell stories about forest people that steal children after dark. We live in the new world, and no one believes in boogeymen anymore. No one except your friend, Terry." "If you want him to stop writing the book," I said, unable to keep the chill out of my voice, "then why don't you just ask him yourself? It's within your power to tell him not to write about town history, I would assume." I heard Sheriff Mackenzie move in an agitated way, but Mayor Register put a hand up, stopping him from doing anything unwise. The man was still smiling, but I noticed it never went to his eyes. His eyes were cold and flinty, like the rock that they dug out of the quarry, and I realized Terry might have been justified in his fears about this man and his lackey, and what they could be doing. So far, Terry hasn't broken any rules. He's a member in good standing of the Historical Society, and as such, is well within his rights to write about history. I just think someone might give him some good advice when it comes to doing things that might end badly for him. No one wants to see an end to what we have here. Forrest gives us everything we need, and it keeps your father and the company he works for employed. Keeps your friends at the logging company employed. It even keeps you in funds. Be a real shame if something put it all to an end and ruined it for everyone else. Don't you think? I spoke before I could think better of it. And those kids that they take to the forest, what are they? A reasonable loss so the good times continue to roll? The mayor shrugged, and that was all the answer I needed. We all feel terrible about the people that go missing, but what's the alternative? Mayors before me have tried to fight back, and it never does any good. Would you rather that the foresters come and take the whole town? No, this is better. We lose a few people, but the gains keep the town alive. Besides, they never take more than they need. I wanted to tell him that was a lie, but it made me think of something I hadn't before. Was there a set amount that they took? Some constant in their theft? I'd always assumed they just took what they wanted, but maybe there was a number, a quota, an end. The mayor drained the cup in a single pull, shuddering as he fought to keep it down. He flapped a hand at me, clearly done with the meeting, and suddenly Sheriff Mackenzie had a hand on my shoulder, and I was being escorted out. It appeared we were done here, but when he raised his voice as I was being frog-marched around the pool, we both stopped. "Oh, before you go, I would consider it your civic duty to report on anything Terry Bremen might be doing that would endanger the town. Otherwise, we might decide you are an accomplice, and that wouldn't be great for your status as a town celebrity. The winds can change at a moment's notice in Rayffered. Be sure you're catching the tailwind instead of being plummeted to the earth." The ride to my parents' house was extremely awkward, but as the sheriff's car rounded the corner, I was already off and running. Sundown was still hours away, and I needed to let Terry know what I had learned. It appeared his paranoia wasn't unfounded. "Sorry, kiddo. That's not something I like to talk about." We were at the breakfast table, and Dad looked away as he let the pancake piece slide off his fork. Mom looked equally as unhappy, and she suddenly remembered that it was almost time for us to get going before we were late. She grabbed up my plate, my own breakfast mostly gone, and I went to grab my stuff so we could head out. Terry had been right. The look on Dad's face was something like fear congealing into paranoia. I could understand that fear, especially if Dad had been approached in the same way I had yesterday. But surely he didn't think I was in cahoots with the sheriff or the mayor. Terry had looked nervous when I went to tell him about the meeting. He asked me if everything was okay when I came back, and when I told him I needed to come in and talk, he let me in straight to the basement. In the bowels of the house, floor above and walls around, I told him what had happened, and he seemed to like it about as much as I did. Crap. I had hoped he wouldn't figure out what we were working on for a while. I knew the second we started moving in the open together, it was only a matter of time. Damn it, I thought we had longer. "What do we do?" I asked, not really sure what to make of this. Intrigue isn't something I'm used to. I just spent 2 years in a place where the enemy shot at you and put bombs on the road. This cloak and dagger stuff wasn't my style. "Nothing," Terry said. "We just act carefully. As far as they know, you're just helping me. You didn't give them anything incriminating, did you?" I shook my head, hoping it was true. "Then as far as they know, you're just assisting me with my book. They can do some shady things in this town, but they can't act without purpose. Not yet. I'm a well-liked person in this community, and you're a war hero for all intents and purposes. If either of us just up and vanished, then there'd be a lot of questions, and a lot of people looking for us. So we just continue to be well-liked, noticeably present, and keep pressing our luck, I guess. He'd taken me home then, and I'd been stewing about it until I finally slipped off that night. I needed that information, sooner rather than later. The ride to the yard was quiet, and I felt I needed to break the tension before Dad thought too much about it. Hey, I didn't mean to stir anything up. I knew it was town history, but I didn't realize it was a sore subject. Dad just continued to drive for a few more blocks, collecting his thoughts before he cleared his throat and nodded. No problem, kiddo. Why do you want to know about that anyway? Some of the guys at work ask you about it? Nah, it was Susan's Uncle Terry. He's writing a book about the Foresters. Well, Forester-related town history, and I'm kind of helping him. He asked me if I knew anything about it, since you were part of it. Dad nodded. Yeah, I heard he was writing something like that. I know he's been collecting stories, but I think he'd do better to leave this one alone. A word of advice, too. Don't ask Garza about it either. What we saw out there is better forgotten. That's been made pretty clear. I wanted to ask him what he meant by that, but he pulled into the parking lot then and told me to have a great day as he rolled out for the yard. Despite his advice, I supposed I would need to speak to Garza about it if I wanted any answers. Dad had been evasive, but Garza wasn't so subtle. I took the front seat when the truck came in, begging Derek to let me have it, even though it was his turn. He shrugged, telling me I'd owe him one, and took a spot in the back. Waited till we got to the outskirts, another neighborhood in need of a sprucing up, and as everyone piled out, I asked the boss if I could have a word before we got started. He nodded, telling Ramsey to make sure everyone got to their assignments, and he closed the door again. "What's up, kid?" he asked, his old face stretching into a smile. "Need some time off or something? I can't pay you for it, but the least I can do is make sure they don't fill your spot." I shook my head. "Nothing like that. I needed to ask if you'd be willing to talk about something, maybe after work sometime." "About?" he asked, his smile slipping a little. "I'm helping Terry Bremen, the town historian, with a book he's writing, a collection of histories, and he's interested in—" "No," he said, all traces of good cheer gone from him. It's just an account of—" "I know what he wants," Garza said, his eyes distrustful. "And you tell Terry he's a coward for sending one of my own guys to try and get it from me. That's not town history, that's personal, and I don't want to hear about it again. I won't hold it against you because, well, you didn't know, and I had already told him no, but I don't want it brought up again. Do we have an understanding?" I nodded, not wanting to push, but knowing I would have to. I climbed out of the truck, but he sat there for a while after I'd gone to get started, clearly ruffled. As I worked that day, I tried to find some reason to learn what Terry needed. There were only 2 people who could tell me, and they had both made it pretty clear they didn't want to talk about it. How was I going to figure out what Terry wanted to know? It wasn't like there were a lot of other people who knew. No one alive, at least. Derek came over during lunch, wanting to know what all that had been about, and I told him it was nothing. "Nothing, hell. Garza's been in a foul mood since you talked to him. He yelled at me earlier for cutting too close to the power pole, and sounded like he would have liked to say more." He had his voice pitched as low as Derek ever did, and I was kind of afraid that people would hear him. "It's nothing. Something someone asked me to ask him. Don't worry about it." The boss's mood didn't improve for the next couple of days, and the improvement cost him dearly. Thursday rolled around, and I still wasn't any closer to figuring out how to get them talking. Garza had been actively avoiding me, and he must have said something to Dad because he was uncharacteristically quiet. If he saw me coming into a room, he always had something to do somewhere else, and last night he had stayed in his room saying he didn't feel well. Chatter was at an all-time low amongst the crew, and they seemed to think I had done something to set Garza off. I couldn't help but notice the cold shoulders I'd been receiving lately, and I suppose I probably deserved it, but they didn't know that. After lunch on Thursday, I went back to my post to find that Garza was already cutting on a tree I'd been putting off. It was this big, gnarly-looking fern gully tree. It was thick around the middle, and both myself and Derek had tried to cut it down without much luck. I saw he had one of those heavy-duty chainsaws, the kind you could use to cut through a metal pipe if you wanted to mess up your blade, and he was making progress, though slowly. I went back to cutting down the normal-sized trees, the ones that were less likely to contain an ancient spirit just looking for freedom, and as I stacked up the little shrub trees, I noticed the smoke. First, I thought it was just exhaust from Garza's saw, but as it kept coming, I saw it was too much for one saw. It was coming in like errant clouds, and I looked around to see who was stupid enough to try to burn something this close to the woods. Maybe someone had burnt up a saw and it had caught in the grass, or someone had tossed a cigarette into something dry. But there was no fire. There was nothing that made the smoke, and I started thinking that it might not be smoke. I was having flashbacks of the day my brother had gone missing, and I realized too late that it was fog. I put down my saw and sat, keeping still as it grew thicker around me. That's when I realized that I could still hear Garza's saw. He hadn't noticed. I started to keep my seat. Surely he would notice soon, but as it got thicker and the saw persisted, I knew he wasn't paying attention to it. He had the tunnel vision, his focus on the task at hand, and he likely thought the fog was just exhaust off his chainsaw. The foresters would creep up on him at this rate, and he'd never see them coming, not unless I did something unwise. I crawled slowly towards the place where the tree had been to try to get to him. The fog had been patchy a few minutes ago, but now it was like traveling through a cloud. The tree I was after should have been less than 20 feet from me, but in this fog I might as well have been in a different country. I was worried that I might get turned around for a moment, but as the back of his safety vest came into view, I tugged on it to get his attention. I didn't dare yell. I had to trust that he would notice when he looked up and cut the engine in time to avoid being dragged off. I must have startled him, though, because he jerked suddenly and the saw came back at him. I didn't know if his leg had gone to sleep or he just slipped, but when he fell back, the saw came back with him and it bit into his leg just below the knee. There was blood, but the doctor would tell me later that he was lucky it hadn't been higher. If it had gone up and into his knee, he might have never walked again, and as it was, it just cut him to the bone. It sounded like it took longer than it did, but it happened in a matter of seconds. 1 minute he was up and cutting, and the next he was down on the ground, the blood running down the denim of his jeans. The saw, thankfully, went off as soon as he stopped squeezing the throttle, and after grunting unhappily on its side for a minute, it cut off. In the meantime, his leg was pouring blood, and he was blowing like an injured elephant. I was left in the fog bank, my boss shaking and yelling as the shadows crouched on the edge of the woods. They too had snuck up on us as I tried to get his attention, and I had to think quickly. My safety vest came off, and I wrapped it as tight as I could around the wound. My bandana came down into his mouth, and as he looked up at me, I put a finger to my lips and bent down to put pressure on the wound. If we both stayed still, just for a little while, maybe they would move on, and we could get Garza some help. He seemed to realize what I was doing and tried to lay as still as he could. He was still convulsing a little, shaking, gasps that racked his whole body, and I heard his quiet sobs against the handkerchief. They moved in the fog like phantoms, and I closed my eyes as the blood soaked through my work gloves. We had to stay still. We had to stay undetected, and when I heard the people calling out to us after an eternity in the fog, I opened my eyes to see that it had all passed. Garza and I were lying beside the big misshapen tree, and the fog was gone, along with its passengers. The others were calling us, and now that the danger had passed, I looked down and noticed how pale he was, and how wet my hands were. I called out, and they came on the run. We had a better bandage on by the time the ambulance got there, and they loaded him into the back with practiced hands. They said he had lost a lot of blood, but he was tough, and he would likely pull through once they got him to the hospital. I hadn't had a doubt, because despite how soaked his pants and my vest had been, his eyes had never closed, and they had roamed constantly as if trying to make sure the danger was gone. He hadn't closed his eyes until he was in the ambulance, and only then did he really seem to relax. I watched it roll away, and as Ramsey came to clap me on the shoulder, I knew I'd been forgiven. "That's two of us you've saved now. If they ever try to reassign you, there might be a fight." Ramsey led the group for a while, but he assured us that Garza would make a full recovery. His injuries were serious, and he'd lost a lot of blood, but he was expected to recover. "He's a tough old bastard," Ramsey joked, having gone to see him every day after work. "He asked me to ask you to come to see him later." He told me after work on Monday. I figured I knew what it was about, and when I went to the hospital to visit him, he told me to close the door. His leg was wrapped in a bandage, a bag beside him pumping antibiotics into his arm, but he looked better than he had in the woods that day. His color was back to normal, and his usual smile was back, if not a little sad. "I owe you my life," he said, not even waiting till I sat down. "Don't mention it. I don't think you would have cut yourself at all if I hadn't startled you." "Nope. I'd have been dragged off by the damn foresters, and that would have been a fate worse than death. You saved my life. I owe you something." "So," he looked like someone had fed him a lemon, "I'm going to tell you what happened during the fire of '95. "Sir, you don't have..." But he put a hand up. "You may not record it, because I don't want anyone knowing that I was the one that told you. But I will tell you the story, and then you're free to do with it what you will. Be aware, if anyone hears you talking about it, they will assume your father told you, and they won't like it. I think you already know there are elements in this town that would like certain parts of our town history redacted. This is one of those pieces of history. Get comfy. This one's a long one." I sat there for 2 hours, listening to the tale of what a previous mayor had done in the woods nearly 30 years ago. A mayor whose actions would seal the fate of 8 other men and himself. It was just starting to feel like autumn, and that's what I'll always remember about that day. The leaves were still half green, the gold just starting to emerge, and that time of year always reminds me of that day. Our boss, Carl Boswick, was not what you would call a smart man. He was greedy, he was ambitious, he could be cruel, and he was certainly lazy. But smart? No, not a day in his life. He had been talking with the mayor, unbeknownst to us, and the 10 of us who made up his crew arrived that day to find Mayor Horace Dewey and Boswick waiting for us in the yard. I wasn't a crew boss back then. I was just another lumberman, and your dad and I were on the Deepwoods crew. We had both served in Vietnam, but there had been no ticker tape parade when we came back. We are pretty good friends, and we watched each other's backs when we came into the woods. There were 5 Deepwoods crews in those days, but we were regarded as the best of those 5. We lost the fewest men, we cut the most lumber, we brought the most wood back to the mill. We were the best, and that was why he chose us. He wanted men who could get the job done, but I don't think even he knew what the job was. "Men, I want to enlist your help for a special job today. Mr. Boswick and I have been talking, and I want to put an end to this forester nonsense." The uproar was immediate, and not particularly productive. We had all grown up with the rules, too, and we knew that you did not fight against the foresters. You stayed still, you hid, but you didn't fight them. They couldn't be fought, as far as we knew. But Dewey quieted us as best he could. I know, this is not how things are normally done, but I know that if anyone can accomplish this, it's the brave men who go into the deep woods. I'm going into the deep woods to attack the heart of the foresters. Come with me, and I'll make sure that each of you are rewarded handsomely. Handsomely turned out to be a year's worth of wages when we succeeded. This was 95. That kind of money could change your life. People were working paycheck to paycheck, and a sum like that could pay off a mortgage, a couple of cars, settle debts, or even help someone start a new life. We agreed to a man, even me, and headed into the woods to earn our reward. You've never seen the deep woods, I assume, and I'm betting your old man doesn't talk about it much. The woods have 3 stages. There's the outskirts, where we work, the mids, where the regular logging crews work, and the deep woods, where the experienced guys go. We were heading deeper than that. We were heading into the heart of Rayffered Woods. This was where Mayor Dewey assured us the foresters made their home. I've been going over the old town documents, he told us as we rode into the deep woods, and I have discovered a way to get rid of them for good. The foresters have a tree that lies in the middle of their camp, a heart tree, and within it lies the thing that gives the foresters their power. We're going to destroy it, and once it's gone, the foresters will be gone too. And how do you propose to just walk into a forester camp? Said your father, bold as brass. We have enough trouble dodging them in the open. I can't imagine trying to sneak into a group of them. Oh no, they won't be at their camp, he assured us. You sound pretty sure of that, your dad said. Do they have an appointment or something? He asked, drawing chuckles from the rest. Nope, Dewey said, the truck coming to a stop. They're going to be too busy putting out fires. We'd stopped next to an area in the woods near the midpoint, a place where we often cut. The stumps were thick out here, but some of them already had sprouts growing from them. Pretty soon, there would be new trees for us to harvest, but I'd never see them reach maturity. I never questioned then why the forest grew so quickly, but I suppose in retrospect it should have seemed off. The trees in Rayffered return as quickly as they fall, and the children are the price we pay. We'd been riding in Boswick's extended cab dually, and the back could easily fit about 4 people. The other 6 had been riding in the back of the truck, the mayor and Boswick in the front, but the guys in the bed hadn't been riding alone. There were 3 large somethings under a tarp, and when we stopped, we learned what was under there. Mayor Dewey put a foot on the tire and stepped up and into the back of the truck. We all knew Dewey. He'd been a logging man too, once upon a time, and it had earned him the votes of a lot of roughnecks. He had promised change, but I don't think we understood how much change he meant to bring. The guys in the back looked at him as he smiled, whipping the tarp off like a magician doing a trick, and revealed 3 drums, 2 of acetone, 1 of benzene, and he told the guys in the back to unload them carefully. He stood there and watched as they put them down, most of them not sure what was going on, but I'd figured it out. I'd been responsible for munitions in the service before I got out. Munitions and chemical storage. I knew how volatile those 3 drums could be. I thought I had an idea what he intended to do, but I prayed I was wrong. This is how we will draw them out, he said, and even Boswick looked shocked. Mayor, I said, finding my courage, I really hope you don't intend to set those off in the forest. But of course, Dewey said, popping the lid on one of them. Even school children know not to set fires, or you'll attract the wrath of the foresters. I'm going to rig up a fuse, he said, taking out a length of fabric, and we'll be on our way before it goes off. We all stood a little straighter, our neck hair up. Setting a fire in the deep woods? He might as well have said that we were going to take a dump on the altar of the Baptist church. None of us could have said why, but lighting a fire in the deep woods was as close to blasphemy as we could think. It wasn't just that it would make the foresters angry, but the deep woods were a place that felt ancient and sacred. I had been in the deep woods since coming back from war at 22, and the feeling of being there was like what I imagined standing at Stonehenge is like. You are a tiny thing standing in the lap of something that was ancient when you were born and will not mourn you when you die. I looked around and realized that all of us felt that way, and they looked as furious as I was. "Mayor," I said, but your dad cut me off. If I was furious, then he was livid. "You can't do that. Are you insane? You'll bring their wrath down on the whole town. They take whole logging camps for brush fires sometimes, for lightning strike blazes. If you set that off in the deep woods, they'll kill us all." Dewey looked up, not really seeming to grasp what he was saying, and when he sparked the lighter, we all took a cautious step back. "I'm going to light this. That should give you about," he thought about it, "a minute before it goes off. In that minute, I would suggest you jump into the back of the truck as quickly as you can, before—" But he needn't have bothered. 8 men, Boswick included, started running for the truck, and all of them piled in as Dewey ran for the cab. Your dad and I, however, ran in the opposite direction, not wanting any part of this. A year's pay wasn't worth what they were about to do. Your dad and I started running before the truck even squealed off, and it was a good thing we did. Those barrels went up about 30 seconds later, and the blast threw both of us 10 feet, even at the distance that we had run. The concussion was like a mortar shell, the heat immediate and intense, and when I picked my head up, shaking it, there was fire in the forest. It was huge, lots of black smoke, and I was struggling to my feet when your dad grabbed me under the arm and hoisted me up. "Run! For the love of God, run!" So we ran. It didn't take them long to find us. The mist came first, like it always does. We were running flat out, really hoofing it, when I saw something from the corner of my eye and yelled for your dad to stop. I think he'd have just kept going otherwise, and you'd have more than one reason to be pissed at those woodland bastards. I had to yell twice, little as I wanted them to hear me, and on the second yell, he froze in place. We didn't have time to sit. We didn't have time to do anything. We just stood there, still as statues, and watched the foresters come. I had seen them before, but never like this. Until then, I'd seen a dozen at a time, but there were at least 50 of them, moving through the woods. They groaned as they walked, like trees in a high wind, and I was afraid they were going to bump into us and find us there. They don't have eyes. Did you know that? They got close enough that I could see that. Their feet sank into the ground, the roots pushing into the ground as they walked. Maybe that's how they find things, through the vibrations on the ground, but at that moment, we were both just trying to remain as still as possible. They turned after a little, more interested in the fire than new converts. They took the mist with them, and when they went, we ran. We ran and ran, neither of us realizing how deep in the woods we'd gone. And just as the sun began to dip, we made it back to the yard. Mr. Camber, the one who owned it when we started, asked us what had happened, and we spelled it out for him. They Took trucks in the next day to pick up survivors, but there was no one. The dually was found near the edge of the deep woods, the border between the foresters' territory and ours, all smashed and wrecked. There wasn't a window unbroken or a piece of metal undented. None of the lumbermen were ever seen again, the mayor either, and an emergency election had to be held. The next mayor made it clear that he would uphold the old ways, and no one ever tried to fight the foresters again. Your dad and I were given a couple of weeks off, and then we got back, and I requested placement on a crew that didn't go to the deep woods. I never wanted to see that place again, though it would still play in my dreams from time to time. That was 15 years ago, but I still wake up with nightmares of that army of foresters sometimes. Garza lay back on his pillows, staring out the window as he pondered whether he had been right to tell it or not. That is the last I will speak of it, and I never want to hear about it again. Go on. I'm tired. I left then, understanding now why Terry had wanted the story so badly, though I didn't even think he really knew why. The information here was a game changer.